Across thousands of years of Chinese history, there have been countless powerful ministers, celebrated statesmen, and men whose fortunes rivaled those of kingdoms. Some changed their age through military victories. Others shaped dynasties through intelligence and political skill. But one name has come to stand almost as a synonym for the word corruption. That name is Heshen. He was once one of the Qianlong Emperor's most trusted officials, a man who rose into the very highest ranks of the Qing court. In less than 20 years, he went from being an ordinary imperial guard to a statesman with influence over government finance, official appointments, and a vast network of political and commercial relationships. During the final decades of the Qianlong reign, Heshen accumulated not only enormous power, but astonishing wealth. Popular tradition claims that when his property was confiscated, it was worth more than 800 million taels of silver, an amount said to exceed several years of Qing state revenue. But the most shocking part of the story is not how much money one man possessed. It is how a man who had stood at the summit of power could, within only 15 days of Qianlong's death, go from being one of the most feared and respected figures in the empire to a prisoner awaiting judgment. Why did the Qing Emperor move so quickly to destroy Heshen? Why did Qianlong continue to employ him for so long, even though he knew that Heshen had serious problems? And how did an intelligent, financially capable official gradually build an empire of wealth around himself? Then there's the famous story of the 800 million tael confiscation list. How much of that number comes from reliable historical records, and how much was enlarged over 2 centuries of retelling? If Heshen had simply been a greedy and stupid villain, this would be an easy story to tell. He flattered the emperor, climbed to the top, stole as much as he could, and was killed the moment a new emperor took power. End of story. But the real history is far more complicated. As a young man, Heshen was intelligent, diligent, quick-minded, and known for an excellent memory. He was trained in both Manchu and Chinese, understood court procedure, could investigate difficult cases, and could handle financial administration. He knew how to raise funds, how to move through complex bureaucratic systems, and, perhaps most importantly, how to understand what Qianlong wanted. Precisely because Heshen was not an incompetent fool, the political and financial network he later created deserves much closer examination. So the real subject of this story is not simply a spectacular confiscation list. It is the story of how a capable young man won an emperor's trust, how that trust gradually became power that almost no one could challenge, how power attracted money, connections, clients, and dependents, and how, once the emperor who supported the entire structure died, a political world built over more than 20 years collapsed in less than half a month. To answer those questions, we cannot begin with the strip of white silk that ended Heshen's life. We have to go back to the 15th year of the Qianlong reign, to a Manchu boy who had no great power, no legendary fortune, and no idea that one day his name would become shorthand for China's most famous corrupt official. Heshen was born in 1750, the 15th year of Qianlong's reign. He belonged to the Neo-Huru clan of the Manchu Plain Red Banner, and later used the courtesy name Zhizhai. So many legends grew around him that the historical Heshen is often hidden behind the version created by popular drama. Some imagine a fat, comic minister with a permanently flattering smile. Others portray him as a lucky courtier who bewitched the emperor with a few clever compliments. Surviving court records and modern scholarship suggest a very different man. He came from a banner family. His father, Chongbao, had served as deputy military commander in Fujian. The family was not poor, but neither did Heshen belong to the kind of supreme aristocracy that could live forever on inherited privilege. More importantly, his childhood was difficult. His mother died when he was young, and his father also died before Heshen reached adulthood. Once the two brothers lost their main protectors, their circumstances became strained. For a banner youth growing up in 18th century Beijing, that meant something very practical. Status inherited from one's ancestors did not automatically produce a career. Education, hereditary office, and an opportunity to enter service still had to be seized. At around 13, Heshen and his younger brother Helen entered the Qianlong Palace School. That institution mattered. It was not simply a private academy where boys memorized a few classical texts. It was one of the Qing institutions used to train promising sons of the Eight Banners and the Imperial Household Department. Students studied Manchu, Chinese, and knowledge directly useful in government service. For Heshen, this education would shape almost everything that followed. His later ability to handle complicated work at Qianlong's side was not based only on reading the emperor's mood. His fundamentals were genuinely strong. Surviving material associated with the Qing court does not hide that fact. Heshen was said to have a powerful memory, quick reactions, good calligraphy, and command of both Manchu and Chinese, while also being able to work with matters involving Mongolian and Tibetan. Qianlong cared intensely about language, ritual, frontier documentation, and administrative detail. An official who could do nothing more than kneel and say, "Your Majesty is wise," would never have been enough. A man who remained close to Qianlong had to remember an old case when the emperor suddenly mentioned it, understand a complicated document when arrived, draft an order on short notice, and still get things done when different offices were blaming one another. Heshen learned that skill very early. At around 18, he married a granddaughter of the Grand Secretarian. The marriage connected him with a major court family, but it would be misleading to say that his entire career was built through his in-laws. What truly changed his life was the ability he displayed once he entered court service, and the speed with which he caught Qianlong's attention. In the 34th year of Qianlong's reign, Heshen inherited a third-class hereditary military title through his family. It gave him a foothold, but it did not guarantee a place at the summit of power. 3 years later, he was appointed a third-class imperial guard. In his early 20s, he had finally entered the physical world around the emperor. Popular legend loves to explain Heshen's rise through a single dramatic moment. One story says that Qianlong quoted an obscure classical line while traveling, and everyone around him fell silent, except Heshen, who knew the answer. Another says the emperor turned, saw a young guard who resembled someone from his past, and immediately took a special interest in him. These stories are famous, but difficult to verify. What history can confirm is that around the 40th year of the Qianlong reign, Heshen suddenly entered the emperor's field of vision, and once he did, his promotion was extraordinary. In 1775, the 40th year of Qianlong's reign, the 26-year-old Heshen became a guard at the gate of heavenly purity and also received a senior banner military appointment. In the first month of the following year, he was appointed vice minister of the Board of Revenue. In the third month, he entered the Grand Council. In the fourth, he became a senior minister of the Imperial Household Department. In other words, within a remarkably short period, this young man who had only recently been part of the guard establishment suddenly had one foot inside the empire's fiscal administration, one inside the highest confidential decision-making body, and another inside the institution that managed the emperor's household and private resources. That kind of rise would make colleagues nervous in any age. What exactly was the Grand Council? It was not a vast ministry. In fact, its power came from being small, fast, and secretive. Grand Counselors handled the emperor's most important political, military, and personnel information. The Board of Revenue managed state finance. The Imperial Household Department managed the imperial family's finances and supplies. By roughly the age of 27, Heshen had reached all three worlds. At a remarkably young age, he could see some of the most important ledgers in the Qing Empire, where the state's money came from, how the emperor's money was spent, how officials were appointed, and how military reports reached the throne. If his only ambition had been to become an able administrator, that experience could have made him one of the finest bureaucrats of his generation. If he later chose to build personal power, the same experience could become something far more dangerous. Why did Qianlong begin trusting him so quickly? The answer is not mystical. First, Heshen worked fast. Even late in life, Qianlong maintained a punishing pace of government and had little patience for officials who were vague, slow, or constantly passing responsibility to someone else. Heshen was good at identifying the point the emperor actually cared about and reducing a complicated problem into a form that could be decided quickly. Second, he learned the emperor's language. Not only Manchu and Chinese, but Qianlong's way of thinking. What kind of memorial did the emperor like? What wording irritated him? In a particular dispute, should one begin with ancestral precedent or present-day necessity? When an official made a mistake, did Qianlong want punishment, or did he want a way to preserve the man's usefulness? Heshen became increasingly skilled at judging these things. More importantly, he did not merely understand what Qianlong wanted. He was willing to turn that will into action. That created a subtle relationship. The emperor began to feel, this man understands me. And Heshen gradually realized that if he could understand the emperor faster than anyone else, he could stand closer to power than anyone else. If we only look a list of offices, we can easily underestimate why Qianlong became so dependent on him. To understand that dependence, imagine an ordinary morning inside the Grand Council. It is still dark when officials begin preparing the documents that must be placed before the throne. Provincial memorials, military dispatches, requests from central ministries, personnel matters, all must be sorted quickly. Heshen knows which issues Qianlong is likely to ask about personally, which figures must be exact, and which names will irritate the emperor if written incorrectly. Once they enter the imperial presence, there may be very little time to explain anything. An ordinary official might spend months preparing a long memorial. Heshen's task was to make the emperor understand the essential point in a few sentences. Qianlong asks, "Why has this still not been completed?" You cannot begin your answer from day one. He asks, "Exactly how much is missing from the treasury?" You cannot reply, "I will go back and check." He asks, "Has this official ever been punished before?" If you have no memory of the case, the next important task may go to someone else. Heshen's memory and speed of response were enormous advantages in that environment. His familiarity with Qianlong's poetry and literary taste was not simply ornamental flattery either. Qianlong wrote an extraordinary number of poems and constantly used verse and literary allusion in government, travel, ceremonies, and daily life. A minister who understood the references could continue the conversation and could draft language in a style the emperor liked naturally developed a sense of intellectual ease with him. For an emperor, the most comfortable minister is not always the most principled one. It is often the minister who makes governing easiest. Heshen made governing easier for Qianlong. That mattered far more than simple flattery. He knew when to speak at length and when to remain silent, when the emperor wanted a practical solution and when he really wanted confirmation that his own judgment was correct. Over time, Heshen became so familiar with the emperor's habits that he could sometimes prepare what was needed before Qianlong asked for it. And so a habit formed. A difficult matter? Call Heshen. Not enough money? Ask Heshen. A complicated case involving a senior official? Ask Heshen. A frontier document no one wants to mishandle? Ask Heshen, a costly celebration that needs financing? Ask Heshen, once a ruler develops that kind of habit, the greatest danger no longer lies in a single gift or bribe. It lies in dependence itself. Dependence changes the standard of supervision. If an ordinary official makes a serious mistake, he may be dismissed. If someone regarded as indispensable makes the same mistake, the emperor is more likely to say, "Be more careful next time." If an ordinary vice minister is accused of misconduct, the emperor may investigate first. If the accused is the man who solves dozens of problems for him every day, the emperor may first wonder whether the accuser has an ulterior motive. That psychology is not unique to Qianlong. People naturally protect those who make their lives and work run smoothly. It was precisely Heshen's ability to understand the emperor, get things done, and respond quickly that accelerated his rise. From the 41st year of Qianlong's reign onward, offices seemed to accumulate around him as if pulled upward by an invisible rope. Senior posts in the historiography office, the imperial household department, the capital security administration, the Chongwomen customs office, and the imperial guard. Individually, the titles looked unrelated. Together, they formed an increasingly dense network of influence. One of those posts deserves particular attention. Supervisor of the Chongwomen Customs Station. People walking through Beijing's Chongwomen today may find it difficult to imagine how important this gate once was as a tax checkpoint. Goods moving into the capital from north and south passed through customs. Merchants, cargo, silver, and documents constantly moved through the gate. Qing customs at Chongwomen produced not only regular tax revenue, but also surplus collections. The formal revenue involved the Board of Revenue, while surplus funds often intersected with the imperial household department and the emperor's own needs. Whoever supervised Chongwomen, therefore, stood in an extremely sensitive position, and Heshen already understood both the Board of Revenue and the imperial household department. That does not prove that from the first day he supervised the customs station. He simply began carrying public silver home. History cannot be written that way, but it does show that Heshen entered the gray spaces of Qing finance earlier and more deeply than most officials. He knew which funds had to be transferred into state accounts and which allowed greater discretion. He understood what a provincial deficit meant, how much a governor might be willing to pay to avoid punishment, where money could be found when the emperor wanted a major celebration, and why an official might describe a serious treasury shortage as merely temporary circulation. Knowledge like that was itself a form of power. In the 43rd year of Qianlong's reign, Heshen was demoted for favoritism and misconduct. That detail matters because it shows that Qianlong did not simply fail to notice any problem. Quite the opposite. During more than 20 years of favor, Heshen was repeatedly reprimanded, demoted, retained in office despite punishment, and publicly criticized for mistakes. The strange part is what happened afterward. Again and again, the punishment failed to end his career. Why? Because Qianlong's judgment was rarely, "This man has no problems." It was closer to, "This man has problems, but he is still useful." As long as the word useful outweighed everything else, reprimands became temporary breaks rather than a final stop. The case that proved Heshen was more than a court favorite came in the 45th year of Qianlong's reign, when he was sent to investigate the powerful provincial official Li Shiyao in Yunnan. Li Shiyao was no minor bureaucrat. He had long served as a senior provincial governor, was highly capable, and had enjoyed Qianlong's trust. After accusations of corruption were made against him, the emperor sent Heshen to Yunnan to investigate. For a man around 31 years old, this was a genuine test. If he found nothing, he would discredit the accusers. If he investigated too aggressively, he risked appearing to attack a man Qianlong had valued. And if he did nothing more than copy testimony into a report, there would be little reason to entrust him with greater responsibilities. After arriving in Yunnan, Heshen began with people around the Shuriyao and quickly obtained evidence of bribery and extortion. Once the case had been established, he did not simply write, "This official is corrupt. Please punish him," and stop there. He continued examining Yunnan's local finance, salt administration, currency, copper production, and frontier affairs. Before he even returned to Beijing, he had already been promoted to president of the Board of Revenue. When he finally met Qianlong, he presented the institutional problems he had observed in Yunnan, and several of his recommendations were accepted. That episode matters. If Heshen were nothing more than a flattering court parasite, it would be difficult to explain why Qianlong trusted him with complicated financial and provincial problems. The Li Shuriyao investigation showed that the young Heshen genuinely possessed the ability to investigate, synthesize information, negotiate, and propose solutions. He understood that a major case should not end merely with the question, who should be arrested? It should lead to the next question, what can the emperor do now? That same year, Heshen's relationship with the imperial family moved even closer. Qianlong arranged a marriage between his beloved 10th princess, Princess Hexiao, and Heshen's eldest son, Fengsheninde. At that point, this was no longer an ordinary relationship between ruler and minister. Heshen was now not only a senior official near the emperor, his family had been joined to the imperial household by marriage. Qianlong's affection for the 10th princess was well known at court. Making Heshen's son an imperial son-in-law created a private bond between the families. Political power, imperial confidence, and family marriage were now layered on top of one another. Around the same period, Heshen's residence became one of the most conspicuous mansions in Beijing. After passing through several owners, it eventually became what is now known as Prince Kang's mansion. Research indicates that around the 45th year of Qianlong's reign, Heshen was involved in building the residence associated with the 10th princess, a project that continued for years. Because it served both as Heshen's home and as part of a princess's marital residence, it was never going to resemble the house of an ordinary official. Yet during the later confiscation, Jiaqing still pointed to several features as clear violations of status regulations, especially Namma timber halls, elaborate display interiors, and garden arrangements said to imitate palace style. Visitors to Prince Kang's mansion today often hear legends about Heshen's hidden treasure. Some say gold was concealed inside a particular stone. Others treat a famous character for a fortune as a secret to explaining his wealth. Some interpret every doorway as proof that he was challenging imperial authority. The more interesting evidence is not in those later stories. It lies in what the architecture suggests about his psychology. Heshen was becoming accustomed to living at the center of power. When a man has only just become an imperial guard, he reminds himself constantly which lines must never be crossed. After 20 years beside the emperor, the greater danger may not be that he suddenly decides to rebel. It is that he begins to believe certain rules no longer apply to him. Still, Heshen's career was not an uninterrupted series of successes. In the 46th year of Qianlong's reign, war broke out in Gansu, and Heshen was sent as an imperial commissioner to supervise military affairs alongside the veteran commander Agui. The qualities that made Heshen effective in finance, documents, and court administration did not translate automatically to the battlefield. According to the draft history of Qing, he misjudged the military situation and later tried to shift responsibility onto officers. After Agui arrived and reorganized operations, the situation improved. Qianlong then accused Heshen of delay, concealing military information and reversing right and wrong, and ordered him back to Beijing. For an ordinary official, a failure like that might have shaped the rest of his life. Yet soon after Heshen returned to the capital, he was again serving in senior military administration and managing the Board of Revenue's major treasuries. This is one of the most revealing features of the relationship between Qianlong and Heshen. The emperor could berate him, demote him, and admit that he was unsuited to certain work. Yet he rarely removed him from the center of power. Heshen learned a dangerous lesson from that pattern. If he could always return to the emperor's side, punishment did not necessarily mean political defeat. The following year, another investigation revealed a different side of his character. The governor of Shandong, Guitai, and the provincial treasurer Yu Yijian were accused of corruption and abuse. Qianlong sent Heshen together with Liu Yong and other officials to investigate. According to the draft history of Qing, Heshen attempted to protect Guitai. During the treasury inspection, he checked only part of the sealed silver and was ready to conclude the examination. Another investigator, Qian Feng, insisted on sealing the treasury and reopening the entire store the following day. Only then did they discover signs that local officials had temporarily borrowed silver from a market to make the treasury appear full. The case was finally proven. By this stage, Heshen was no longer simply a young official trying to impress the emperor by solving whatever problem he was given. He now had relationships, political calculations, and interests of his own. Who counted as one of his people? Who might become an ally? Who was worth protecting? Who could be sacrificed? These questions increasingly entered his political thinking. Once power changes from the office the emperor gave me into the network I can mobilize, its nature changes. This is where Heshen's real danger began. Many people imagine corruption as an official opening a treasury at night and secretly carrying home boxes of silver. High-level corruption in a large bureaucracy rarely works that simply. At the top of government, power is usually converted into money through far more subtle channels. It can hide inside appointments and recommendations, inside whether a case is processed quickly or allowed to sit, inside whether someone speaks a sentence in your defense or remains silent, inside customs surpluses, inside the management of fines, or simply inside the shared understanding that if you want this matter resolved, you know whose door to visit first. Heshen was becoming exactly that kind of man. He did not need to personally hold out his hand to every official. Once the entire bureaucracy understood that his opinion could shape the emperor's view, benefits would begin finding their own way to his gate. A local official hoping for promotion would try to reach him. A governor under investigation would look for an intermediary who could speak to him. A merchant seeking privilege would pay attention to anyone connected with the Heshen household. And a senior official who knew that his case would eventually pass through the Grand Council would think very carefully before offending the man who controlled so much confidential information. This kind of power is difficult to draw on a map, but it can be worth more than a treasury. And one of Heshen's most important talents was that he understood money. At this point, we need to separate two ideas: financial ability and corruption. A man can understand finance and still be corrupt. Likewise, the fact that he later became corrupt does not mean every administrative skill he displayed earlier in life was fake. While handling affairs in Yunnan, Heshen genuinely made proposals concerning the salt administration, currency, customs collection, and copper production. Scholars studying late Qianlong finance have also noted that he spent years working across the Board of Revenue, the Imperial Household Department, and the Qianlong Customs Office. He understood how both state finance and imperial household finance operated. Qianlong valued ministers like that because late in his reign, the emperor faced an increasingly practical problem. A prosperous empire was expensive. Wars cost money. River control projects cost money. Disaster relief cost money. Imperial celebrations cost money. Royal tours cost money. Construction projects cost money. An emperor could issue edicts calling for frugality and concern for the people, but every command issued by a huge state eventually came down to silver. Qianlong wanted to preserve the image of imperial prosperity, frontier security, and court magnificence without appearing to impose endless new taxes. So an official who could find extra sources of revenue without directly changing the formal tax system became extremely useful. That is the background necessary to understand one of the most controversial fiscal practices of the late Qianlong reign: the payment of atonement silver. Broadly speaking, senior officials who committed certain offenses could sometimes pay substantial fines in hopes of receiving a reduced punishment. The general idea of paying money in mitigation of punishment was not invented out of nothing by Heshen, and historians debate exactly when the practice should be said to have begun. But after the 46th year of Qianlong's reign, these payments became increasingly common, and Heshen played a major role in administering and expanding them. On the surface, the arrangement looked clever. An official made a mistake. The emperor did not necessarily have to dismiss him immediately. Instead, the official could be fined. The court demonstrated punishment and obtained another source of revenue at the same time. For the emperor, the state retained an experienced official and received silver. For the official, paying money was often preferable to losing his career or facing something worse. But the problems were obvious. If an official knew that serious misconduct might be reduced to a price he could afford, law and discipline themselves began to acquire a market value. And where did the money used to pay the fine come from? If a governor already faced a treasury deficit and then had to produce tens of thousands of taels, he might squeeze his subordinates more aggressively, turn to merchants, or transfer the burden downward. The court would see a fine arrive in Beijing. People in the provinces might feel the cost through layers of additional extraction. And when someone like Heshen sat in the middle of the system, the arrangement became even more complicated. He understood how badly the emperor needed money. He also understood what officials feared. He could present a fine as a useful way to raise funds for the throne, while simultaneously allowing officials to understand that maintaining a good relationship with him might help reduce certain risks. The boundary between public finance, the emperor's personal requirements, bureaucratic punishment, and private influence began to blur. That was exactly the kind of space in which Heshen learned to thrive. He was not simply standing outside the system and robbing it. He was becoming a man who knew how to manipulate the spaces inside the system itself. In the 49th year of Qianlong's reign, Heshen was transferred to lead the board of civil appointments, became an assistant grand secretary, and continued to exercise influence over the Board of Revenue. He later rose to the rank of Grand Secretary of the Wenhua Hall. By his late 30s, he held enormous influence across administration, personnel, finance, confidential policy, palace affairs, and imperial cultural projects. And he was not an uncultivated political thug. He served in senior positions connected with the compilation of the complete library of the four treasuries, the historiography office, the Wenyuan Library, the Hamlin Academy, and the imperial examination system. Qianlong loved poetry, calligraphy, scholarship, and large cultural enterprises, and Heshen made sure he could operate in those worlds as well. The Palace Museum still preserves examples of his calligraphy. The quality of a man's handwriting does not become poor simply because the man later becomes corrupt. That is one of the uncomfortable facts of history. A person can possess serious moral flaws and still have taste, learning, intelligence, and administrative ability. If Heshen were merely a ridiculous villain who smiled foolishly at the emperor, his story would be much simpler. The real Heshen is more troubling precisely because he was intelligent. Intelligence helped him understand the rules quickly, and then it helped him learn how to use those rules for himself. As his rank rose, Heshen no longer had to think only about how to carry out the emperor's instructions. He also had to manage the growing number of people and interests that had gathered around him. In the 51st year of Qianlong's reign, the censor Cao Shibao began paying attention to the extravagant lifestyle of Heshen's household servant Lu Quan. Cao did not possess direct evidence proving corruption by Heshen himself, so he attacked Lu Quan instead, accusing him of building a residence beyond the status legally permitted to a servant. The emperor understood the real target. He demanded evidence that could prove Heshen's personal misconduct. But before the investigation could fully develop, Heshen had already received warning and ordered Lu Quan to alter or remove the most questionable construction. When inspectors finally arrived, they could not find evidence strong enough to convict Heshen. Cao Shibao was punished instead. The message sent to the bureaucracy was more powerful than any public speech. Accuse Heshen without airtight evidence, and you might destroy yourself. And by the time you obtain the evidence, it may already be gone. After that, who would step forward easily? That does not mean Qianlong was completely deceived by Heshen. In fact, in the same year, the emperor criticized him for recommending officials too freely. Because Heshen had also remained in charge of the Chongwomen Customs Station for too long, and because the scandal involving his servant had attracted attention, Qianlong eventually removed him from that post. The emperor still adjusted Heshen's power. He still slapped his hand when he thought he had gone too far. But Heshen had learned something else. A slap on the hand was not the same thing as being cast out. As long as the emperor ultimately needed him, power would return, and that made him politically bolder. Over the next several years, Heshen's relations with some of the most senior figures at court became increasingly tense. The most famous was Agoué. Agoué was a major statesman of the Qianlong era whose authority had been earned through decades of warfare and military administration. In seniority, achievement, and prestige, he stood far above the younger Heshen. The two had already clashed during the campaign in Gansu and remained hostile afterward. The draft history of Qing even records that when they were both on duty, Agoué sometimes refused to share the same workroom with Heshen. That detail may carry the moral coloring of later historical writing, but makes one thing clear: not everyone at the top of the Qing state respected Heshen. Other senior officials, including Wang Jie and Zhu Guwei, also came into conflict with him. Zhu Guwei was especially important because he had once been a tutor to the man who would become the Qing Emperor. Late in Qianlong's reign, the emperor considered bringing Zhu Guwei back into the central government. Heshen feared that a minister with such a close relationship to the future ruler might threaten his position, and he worked to block the appointment. By this point, Heshen was no longer satisfied with simply making the emperor like him. He was beginning to manage who else could reach the emperor. The difference sounds small. Politically, it is enormous. A favorite is someone the ruler prefers. A power broker is someone who begins to control information, personnel, and the routes by which other people gain access to the ruler. Around the 55th year of Qianlong's reign, another episode showed how dangerous that control over information could become. A senior official named Yin Zhuangtu submitted a memorial warning that provincial granaries and treasuries in several regions suffered serious shortages. If true, his accusations threatened one of the images Qianlong cared about most late in life: the image of a prosperous, well-governed empire. Qianlong was furious. Heshen proposed what sounded like a perfectly fair solution. If Yin Zhuangtu claimed the deficits were real, let him travel to the provinces and inspect the accounts himself. So he did, accompanied by officials sent with him. The result recorded in the draft history of Qing is deeply ironic. Wherever the inspection team went, local administrations had enough warning to move money, borrow funds, and temporarily patch the books. By the time the treasuries were formally examined, the accounts often looked respectable. Zhuangzi failed to prove the widespread deficits he had originally described. Instead, he was punished for making reckless accusations. The real damage from an episode like this was not limited to one official. It taught the bureaucracy a way to survive. If the emperor likes hearing something, make sure he sees it. If the emperor does not want to hear something, think very carefully before becoming the first person to say it. The most dangerous moment for a dynasty is not always when no one sees the problem. Sometimes it is when people who do see the problem begin to wonder whether speaking is worth the risk. Heshen did not single-handedly create every form of corruption in the late Qianlong era. A vast empire does not develop fiscal deficits, provincial embezzlement, and military waste because of one man alone. Blaming everything on Heshen would be as simplistic as giving all the credit for an empire's successes to a single emperor. But Heshen sat at the center of power for decades, and he did help shape an atmosphere in which following the emperor's preferences could be safer than delivering uncomfortable truths, and building a relationship with the most powerful minister could be more effective than simply trusting formal rules. Once established, that kind of culture reinforces itself. Why did officials bring gifts to Heshen? Because other officials did. Why did they try to use his connections? Because they feared that the officials who refused to do so would lose out. Why did provincial governors want his friendship? Because sooner or later they might face an evaluation, an accusation, a treasury deficit, a military reimbursement, a construction audit, or a promotion. And some part of that process was likely to pass through an institution Heshen understood or influenced. When everyone begins saying, that is simply how things work, corruption is no longer only one person breaking the rules. It becomes a second, unofficial set of rules. That is also why Heshen's wealth cannot be understood simply by asking, how much did he steal directly from the treasury? His fortune probably accumulated through several overlapping channels. Gifts connected to official favors were one layer. Pawn shops, money shops, land, lending, and commercial investment were another. As the emperor's favorite, Heshen also received repeated legitimate rewards. At the same time, his relatives, household servants, and political dependents formed a private network of their own. His servant Lu Quan was later found to possess property worth more than 200,000 taels, along with valuable jewels. How does a household servant become that rich? The answer is probably not that Lu Quan was a financial genius. In traditional systems of power, doorkeepers, stewards, and personal attendants could become enormously wealthy because they controlled the gate to someone more powerful than themselves. If an outside official could not simply walk in a Heshen study, whom did he see first? If a merchant wanted to present a gift, but could not carry a chest of silver directly into the home of a grand counselor, whom did he approach? If someone wanted to know whether Heshen was in a good mood, when he might receive visitors, or whether a particular issue had already been mentioned to the emperor, whom did he ask? The more powerful the master, the more valuable the doorway became. And so the rents generated by power spread outward in layers. Heshen became rich. Lu Quan became rich. Then people below Lu Quan discovered that even knowing Lu Quan could itself be converted into advantage. That is what makes a genuine empire of corruption so dangerous. It is not a secret room. It is a supply chain. By the 53rd year of Qianlong's reign, Heshen was rewarded for military-related service with the noble title of third-class Earl Zhongxiang. In the 54th year, the 10th princess formally married Feng Sheninde. After the wedding, Qianlong personally visited his daughter's residence. Imagine the atmosphere in Heshen's household that day. Imperial banners pass through the gate. Every courtyard has been cleaned until not a trace of dust remains. Servants have probably rehearsed the ceremony again and again. And Heshen stands there waiting to receive not merely the emperor, but the clearest possible proof of everything he has achieved over the previous decade. 20 years earlier, he had been an orphan banner youth studying in a government school. Now the emperor himself enters his home. His son is married to Qianlong's favored daughter. How many officials in all of Beijing could claim treatment like that? Moments like this make people believe one of the most dangerous ideas in politics. What I have today will never disappear. History has a habit of punishing that illusion. Heshen's true security had never come from law. It had never come from an institution. It came from one man, Qianlong. And at this point, we have to confront one of the central questions in the entire story. Did Qianlong really have no idea what Heshen was doing? Did he truly not know that Heshen was corrupt? There may never be a simple answer. The surviving record shows Qianlong repeatedly reprimanding Heshen for mistakes. He knew Heshen's household had created controversy. He punished him for improper recommendations, favoritism, and misconduct. So the emperor was clearly not completely blind. But knowing that he has problems is not the same thing as knowing exactly how much property he owns. Knowing that people give him gifts is not the same thing as deciding that the man must now be executed. Qianlong's attitude was probably closer to selective tolerance. Heshen was useful. He could process complicated government business. He understood finance. He could grasp an imperial instruction immediately. When the emperor needed money, he could often find a way to raise it. He handled problems Qianlong did not want to face personally. His presence reduced the administrative burden of governing an empire late in an aging emperor's reign. As long as Qianlong believed the benefits outweighed the risks, Heshen remained valuable. And Heshen was exceptionally skilled at preserving that value. That is why their relationship was more complicated than the simple morality play of a foolish emperor and a wicked minister. Qianlong was not stupid. Heshen did not reach the top through one lucky encounter. What they developed was closer to a long-term political partnership. Qianlong gained an executor who understood him extraordinarily well. Heshen gained the protection that came from standing beside ultimate power. Early on, that partnership could increase administrative efficiency. Later, as supervision weakened, it created enormous side effects. The more closely Heshen understood the emperor, the more easily he could understand what the emperor did not want to see. The more capable Heshen became, the more reluctant Qianlong was to lose him. The more indispensable he seemed, the more difficult he became for anyone else to supervise. Eventually, ability and danger became two sides of the same coin. So if we ask why Heshen was able to accumulate so much corrupt wealth, the answer cannot simply be Qianlong was old and senile. At least 5 forces came together. First, Heshen himself was intelligent, hardworking, and highly effective, which repeatedly brought him more important offices. Second, he became extraordinarily good at understanding Qianlong and turning the emperor's personal preferences into political advantage. Third, he spent decades moving simultaneously through finance, personnel, confidential policy, and palace administration, giving him an information advantage few officials could imagine. Fourth, through marriage, protégés, servants, officials he promoted, and commercial connections, he created a private network that extended beyond his formal titles. And fifth, the institutional environment of Qianlong's final years gave him room to grow. The emperor was aging. The image of imperial prosperity had to be protected. Fiscal demands were complicated. Sensorial criticism became riskier. All of those forces made Heshen increasingly difficult to challenge. Remove any one of them, and the later Heshen might never have existed. That is one of the most important things to understand about powerful ministers. They do not suddenly appear fully formed. Institutions surrender space to them a little at a time. When we look backward from the final confiscation, it is tempting to imagine that the entire story was always written in silver. But the beginning may have been something much smaller. An emperor notices that a young guard is unusually useful. The first promotion looks reasonable. The second additional appointment seems necessary. A third department is placed under him for the sake of efficiency. The fourth time he makes a mistake, the emperor thinks he is talented. Keep him in office for now. The fifth time someone accuses him, the evidence is insufficient. By the time all those small exceptions accumulate, a great political power already exists. History almost never announces. Today, the empire of corruption officially begins. Instead, it repeats a much quieter sentence. Just this once, we will handle it this way. Heshen became a master at living inside just this once. And if we look again at his financial ability, we find another fact that popular drama often misses. He did not merely know how to bring money into his own household. He genuinely helped Qianlong solve difficult fiscal problems. That is what makes the judgment harder. A completely incompetent man could not have spent decades managing the Board of Revenue's treasuries, the Qianlong Customs Office, the Imperial Household Department, and large volumes of military reimbursement. Qianlong was not ignorant of financial figures. If Heshen's accounts had been a disaster every time he touched them, he would not have remained at the center of government for more than 20 years. What Qianlong valued was Heshen's ability to answer one of the most difficult questions in government. Where will the money come from? Sometimes the answer was ordinary tax revenue. Sometimes it was the redistribution of surpluses. Sometimes it was fines. Sometimes it meant forcing provinces and officials to absorb greater costs. Those solutions could solve the emperor's immediate problem. They were not necessarily good for the long-term health of the state. This is where fiscal management can create an illusion. Raising an extra million taels today does not mean the country has actually created a million taels of new wealth. If the money ultimately comes from a governor demanding it from subordinates, and those subordinates recover it from merchants and ordinary households, the central government sees more revenue, while the local economy becomes more fragile. Many of Heshen's financial methods have to be understood through that downward transmission of pressure. The atonement fines are the clearest example. The emperor sees a flexible source of revenue. A governor who has been fined sees the price of keeping his office. People at the bottom may experience it as a new levy, a new fee, or harsher collection. Every level thinks it is merely solving its own problem. The people who ultimately pay the cost may have no idea what decision was made in Beijing. So Heshen's story is not only a history of one man's greed. It is also a story about the conversion between money and power inside a huge bureaucracy. Heshen did not become rich by physically reaching into the pocket of every commoner. He stood much higher in the system. He could influence who received funds and who paid them, whose misconduct could be settled with money, whose deficit would be investigated, whose memorial reached the emperor quickly, whose name appeared on a list of recommendations. When you control those switches, wealth begins finding your door by itself. That is what the phrase empire of corruption should really mean. Not simply that Heshen owned a magnificent mansion, but that his private interests increasingly overlapped with the operating machinery of the state. If we move the camera back to the years when Heshen was in his 30s and 40s, we can see that his power did not reach its maximum all at once. It grew like a building to which another floor was added every few years. Around the 48th year of Qianlong's reign, he received further honors and served in senior posts connected with the historiography office and the Wenyuan library. In the 49th year, he became head of the board of civil appointments and assistant grand secretary, while continuing to influence financial affairs. In the 51st year, he received the title of Grand Secretary of the Wenhua Hall. By the 53rd year, he had been elevated to an earl. Later, he also headed the Hamlin Academy and supervised matters connected with the Imperial Medical Institute and the Imperial Pharmacy. The names of all those offices can be dizzying today. Translated into the language of power, however, they are simple. The Board of Civil Appointments meant careers and promotions. The Board of Revenue meant money and grain. The Board of Punishments meant criminal cases. The Grand Council meant the empire's most sensitive information. The Imperial Household Department meant the emperor's household, supplies, and private financial resources. The senior command of the Imperial Guard meant security around the emperor himself. The Hamlin Academy and Historiography Office meant scholarship, official culture, and prestige among the educated elite. Heshen was not climbing one ladder. He was reaching across several ladders at the same time. That made him one of the rare figures in late Qianlong government who could connect separate systems. Imagina provincial trisuri deficit. At first, it is a Board of Revenue problem. If corruption lies behind the deficit, it may become a criminal matter for the Board of Punishments and the censorate. If the accused is a governor general, the proposed decision may go to the Grand Council. If the emperor chooses to impose a financial penalty, the resulting funds may intersect with the Imperial Household Department. For an ordinary official, those are 4 or 5 different institutions. For Heshen, they all existed within his field of vision. That was efficient. It was also dangerous. Modern organizations worry when one person controls approval, finance, audit, and personnel at the same time because independent oversight disappears. The Qing Dynasty did not speak the language of modern corporate governance, of course, but the principle remains familiar. If one official can influence who is appointed, who is investigated, and how public money is reimbursed, supervising him becomes extremely difficult. Heshen did not permanently hold every position at the same time, nor did he personally dictate every decision in every office. But more than 2 decades of repeated overlapping appointments gave him cross-departmental experience and personal connections that ordinary ministers simply did not possess. Real power often does not come from the sentence, "I legally have authority to order you." It comes from another sentence, "I know who to call." Heshen knew. He knew which vice minister had an old relationship with which governor. He knew who drafted a military dispatch. He knew which treasury had suffered problems before. He knew what kinds of mistakes made Qianlong especially angry. And he knew when the emperor's mood might turn an ordinary offense into a severe punishment. That gave him an enormous advantage in political negotiation. A provincial governor might write 1,000 characters explaining a deficit. Heshen might need only 2 sentences in front of the emperor to frame that explanation as either understandable under the circumstances or a dishonest attempt to evade responsibility. That is why ministers did not only fear Heshen's ability to promote them, they feared his ability to define them. In a political system heavily dependent on the personal judgment of the emperor, the person who shapes the emperor's first impression possesses a hidden form of judicial power. Historical sources preserve several controversial examples of the way Heshen used that power. He protected people who were willing to attach themselves to him and try to push aside those who refused. The draft history of Qing gives an extremely harsh judgment. It says Heshen was skilled at reading Qianlong's mind, that he looked for opportunities to provoke the emperor against men who would not join him, and that when officials brought gifts or requests, he sometimes helped them by delaying a matter until the emperor's anger had cooled. The account was written later and carries the moral judgment traditionally directed at a defeated power minister. But the political technique it describes is entirely plausible. An emperor's anger has a timetable. The day he reads a memorial, he may want an official dismissed immediately. 3 days later, a military victory arrives. Another minister offers an explanation, or the emperor's attention shifts. and suddenly there is no need for the harshest punishment. If a grand counselor can influence when an issue returns to the throne, then he can influence the temperature at which punishment is imposed. That was one reason Heshen became so valuable. Many people were not paying him a simple thank you fee. They were buying a possibility. The possibility that their memorial would be interpreted more favorably. The possibility that their case would wait until the emperor's anger cooled. The possibility that their name would appear on a recommendation list. The possibility that when someone accused them, another voice would speak a sentence in their defense. As long as such possibilities could be bought, there would never be a shortage of buyers. There is another fascinating contradiction in Heshen's story. The richer he became, the less practical it was simply to hide silver. Wealth itself had to be managed. The official charges against him later mentioned pawn shops and money shops in places such as Tongzhou and Jizhou. Later confiscation lists include large amounts of land, shops, pawn businesses, and other commercial property. The precise numbers in many later lists are unreliable, but Heshen's household involvement in business was not invented from nothing. Why would one of the most powerful men in the empire operate pawn shops? Because silver buried underground does not grow. Pawn shops and money shops could lend capital and earn interest. They could also acquire collateral cheaply when borrowers were desperate. Land generated rent. Property and commercial businesses could convert a one-time political gift into long-term income. In other words, Heshen was not simply receiving money. He was converting the proceeds of power into assets. A bar of gold carried through the gate remains a bar of gold. Use it as capital for a money shop, and it can become a continuing stream of income. That is why confiscation records for powerful officials so often contain far more than piles of silver. Land, shops, contracts, debts, and claims. The truly wealthy rarely hold all of their wealth in metal. And that is precisely why calculating Heshen's total fortune is so difficult. How many taels was a Beijing mansion worth? At what year's prices should dozens of hectares of farmland be valued? Who decides the value of antiques, pearls, and jade? If a pawn shop is listed with capital of more than 100,000, does that mean only its cash principal, or does it include outstanding loans? Does an imperial quality work of art have the same value in a forced confiscation sale that it would command from a private collector? Change the valuation method, and the final number changes dramatically. That is why claims that Heshen's fortune was precisely 800 million taels, followed by modern conversions into trillions of dollars or yuan, should be treated with extreme caution. Even the tael itself was not a single standardized paper currency unit in the modern sense. Different weight standards, including treasury and customs taels, could vary. The purchasing power of silver changed across region, year, and commodity. Compare the amount with grain prices, and you get one modern equivalent. Compare it with land, official salaries, or annual state revenue, and you get another. The responsible conclusion is therefore simple. Heshen's confiscated wealth was enormous. There is no serious doubt about that. The famous figure of 800 million taels is one of the best-known later traditions, but it is not reliable enough to be treated as an exact audited total. The concrete figures listed in Jiaqing's formal charges are more useful. More than 26,000 taels of gold hidden inside walls. Another 6,000 taels of gold in private storage. More than 3 million taels of silver buried underground. Silver, clothing, and other property said to exceed 10 million in value. A servant, Lu Quan, with property exceeding 200,000. And on top of that, pearls, gemstones, real estate, pawn shops, money shops, and other assets. Those numbers are already extraordinary. They do not need a myth added to them. Even more interesting is the fact that Heshen did not stop working as his wealth increased. In many television dramas, a corrupt grandee eventually becomes little more than a man eating, drinking, and enjoying luxury. The historical Heshen remained extremely busy. He continued entering the palace, handling grand council business, participating in examinations, managing cultural projects, and dealing with a wide range of administrative affairs. That was one major difference between him and aristocrats who lived purely on family status. He could be corrupt and hardworking at the same time. He could build a private network of interests while still completing many of the emperor's assignments at great speed. That sounds contradictory. It is not. Someone interested only in laziness rarely climbs this high. The more sophisticated the corruption, the more ability it may require. You have to understand the system to know where the loopholes are. You have to understand people to know who will cooperate. You have to understand accounts to know how assets can be hidden. And you have to understand the emperor to know which line must never be crossed and which line might be tested. The most dangerous thing about Heshen was that he possessed almost all of those abilities. In 1793, the British Macartney embassy arrived at the Qing court. The mission later became famous for disputes over ritual, trade, and the relationship between Britain and the Qing Empire. We do not need to enter that diplomatic history here. One detail is enough. Foreign observers who saw Heshen did not describe a ridiculous comic buffoon. Materials cited by the Palace Museum preserve descriptions of a man with an impressive appearance, linguistic ability, and quick, practice conversation. That perspective is useful precisely because it came from people who did not live inside Beijing's court politics. You may condemn Heshen's corruption, but when he stood before foreign envoys in the robes of a senior Qing statesman, it is difficult to deny that he could look like a highly capable, quick-minded servant of the empire. Perhaps that is much closer to the Heshen Qianlong saw, not the theatrical face of a villain from a later stage play, but a man who was exceptionally useful. The longer Qianlong reigned, the more he depended on people who already understood his pace. A young emperor can experiment endlessly with new officials. An emperor in his 80s is more likely to trust men who have worked beside him for decades. Every day, Heshen became safer because of that trust, and every day, that safety made him more dangerous. In the 56th year of Qianlong's reign, Heshen was punished for failures in treasury management. In the 59th year, he was demoted for delays in handling ginseng and other items in official storage. In the 60th year, he was again reprimanded and demoted while being retained in office over cases involving frontier administration and questions for the military examinations. Put those years side by side, and a strange picture emerges. Heshen seems constantly to be making mistakes, and constantly to be rising. That was not because the punishments were imaginary. Demotion while retained in office could preserve an official's actual duties. It allowed the emperor to express displeasure without replacing someone immediately. Heshen received this kind of punishment repeatedly, so the bureaucracy watched a frustrating cycle. Heshen is scolded. Everyone thinks he is finally finished. A few months later, he is still there. Sometimes he has even acquired another responsibility. Over time, accusers learn to remain silent. Followers become more confident. The strongest proof of power is not that no one ever criticizes you. It is that criticism comes, and you're still standing in the same place afterward. Qiao Shibao's fate became one of the clearest examples of that psychological shift. Qian Feng was able to expose Guotai's treasury fraud because he insisted on sealing the treasury and uncovering the temporary silver that had been borrowed to disguise the deficit. But officials like Qian Feng could not appear in every investigation. Most people calculated the risk. If an accusation succeeded, the emperor might reward you. If it failed, your career might be over. And the man on the other side was the emperor's favorite grand counselor. That is why an established corruption network cannot be defeated simply by telling everyone to be braver. Every individual may make the choice that is safest for himself. and worse for the system as a whole. Heshen did not need to threaten everyone. He only needed a few challengers to pay a visible price. Others would learn the lesson. Qianlong, meanwhile, could tell himself that irresponsible censors disrupted government with speculation and that he, the emperor, remained the final judge. Each side possessed a logic that made sense from its own position. The result was weaker and weaker oversight. That was the soil in which Heshen's fortune could truly grow. And when a man spends years under special protection, the thing that changes is not only how other people see him. His own sense of risk and boundaries changes as well. The emperor's favoritism becomes an institutional fact. Why did Qiao Shibao suffer? Officially, because his evidence was insufficient. But what did the bureaucracy actually learn? Not, next time, prepare a better case. It learned, better not touch Heshen. The difference between those two lessons can transform an entire system of oversight. Heshen also became increasingly aware of exactly how much weight he carried with the emperor. He had been reprimanded many times, which meant he understood Qianlong's limits better than a man who had never been criticized. After one punishment, does the emperor summon me again a few days later? If yes, the crisis has passed. After one accusation, have any of my important responsibilities been removed? If not, the political foundation remains. Live in that environment for long enough, and your calculation of risk changes. The first time you accept something you should not, perhaps you're nervous. The second time, no one investigates. The third time, subordinates bring gifts without being asked, and it begins to feel normal. Eventually, illegality no longer feels illegal. It feels like the way everyone does things. That is not an excuse for Heshen. It is an explanation of why corruption becomes most dangerous when the participant no longer needs to persuade himself that he is doing anything unusual. Heshen's luxury did not suddenly appear either. The higher his office, the larger his social world became, and the more his residents had to display status. His son married a princess, giving the household a genuine imperial connection. Qianlong continually bestowed gifts, so rare objects legitimately accumulated in the home as well. Legal wealth, imperial rewards, resources created by marriage, commercial profits, and illicit gifts became mixed together. From the outside, the boundaries grew harder to see. Heshen himself may gradually have stopped seeing them clearly. One jewel was a gift from the emperor. The jewel beside it came from a provincial governor. One house was purchased legally. Was another parcel of land transferred cheaply by someone desperate for silver? Did the capital of a commercial business come from years of legitimate savings, or from gifts that could never be explained in public? By the time confiscation came decades later, it may have been impossible to reconstruct the origin of every tale. That is another reason later attempts to explain Heshen's entire fortune through one confiscation list run into trouble. Wealth was the outcome. Power was the machine that produced it. Look again at the Li Shiyao investigation, and the contrast between Heshen's early and later career becomes obvious. The young Heshen went to Yunnan to investigate another Qianlong favorite. He proved the case and then returned to Beijing with observations about provincial finance. That is the classic path of an able minister. Create value by solving the emperor's problem. More than a decade later, in the Guitai case in Shandong, the historical record describes him attempting to protect an accused official. Why the change? Perhaps it was not that he suddenly transformed from a good man into a bad one. Perhaps his position had changed. When he was young, Heshen had no large personal network. His greatest interest was therefore to perform the emperor's assignment well. Once he became powerful, he had people to protect, potential allies, gift givers, and private relationships. At that point, investigate to the very end might damage his own interests. When an official becomes both referee and interested party, the system enters dangerous territory. That is why Heshen's life is not a simple morality tale in which a good boy was corrupted by money. It is a story about the way power gradually changes a person's structure of interests. The higher he stands, the more people around him need his protection. The more people he protects, the more he needs to retain power. To retain that power, he must block people who might challenge it. The network first created to get work done slowly becomes a faction that has to be defended. That is the self-locking structure of a power minister. The relationship between Qianlong and Heshen changed in the same way. At first, an emperor promoted a talented young guard. Then he relied on an increasingly mature financial and administrative assistant. Later, Heshen knew almost every important habit of Qianlong, and the two developed long-term dependence. Once Qianlong became emperor emeritus, old age deepened that dependence even further. A network of power can sound abstract until we place the camera in front of an ordinary provincial official, a governor under accusation, or the gatehouse of Heshen's mansion. Then the structure behind the wealth becomes easier to see. Imagine a provincial official who has just become eligible for promotion. He knows that people in the board of civil appointments speak well of him. He also knows that Heshen's voice carries enormous weight with the emperor. So when he travels to Beijing, he brings a local gift. Gift exchange was common in Qing official culture. Not every gift can automatically be defined as a bribe, but once the recipient can influence your promotion, personal courtesy and political power become almost impossible to separate. The first gift is respect. The second is sent because everyone else sends one. The third may carry a specific request. Eventually, everyone understands that the rules have changed. No sign needs to be hung outside the gates saying, "Silver required for official business." Unwritten rules are most effective when no one needs to write them down. Now imagine a governor who has just been accused. He knows Qianlong is furious. He also knows that no one understands the emperor's moods better than Heshen. He may not need Heshen to promise, "I will save you." All he needs is one sentence. Wait for now. Those words are worth money. Waiting creates time to repair accounts, find witnesses, ask friends to speak, or hope that a new military report will shift the emperor's attention. High-level corruption, therefore, rarely resembles robbery. It is more like selling time, information, and access to power. Heshen possessed all three of those scarce resources. That is why Lu Quan mattered so much. The busier the master, the less possible it becomes for him to meet everyone personally. Who decides which calling card enters the inner rooms? Which gift is accepted? Which visitor is received today? And which one is told to return next month? That person becomes part of the machinery of power. The busiest room in a great minister's residence may not be the reception hall. It may be the gatehouse. In the morning, letters arrive. At noon, gifts. In the afternoon, acquaintances come asking for information. At night, the steward prepares a list of the day's visitors. Which governor sent a representative? What did a salt merchant bring? Who is seeking an appointment for a relative? Whose family currently has a case before the Board of Punishments? A private visitor list can sometimes explain how power actually works better than an official register of titles. Historical documents do not preserve every one of these daily transactions, but the fortunes of Heshen and Lu Quan, the later punishment of officials accused of frequenting Heshen's gate, and historical accounts of gifts and private petitions all allow us to see the outline of such a network. And networks like this have a natural tendency. They reward the people most skilled at maneuvering around formal rules. An honest official with no connections waits 3 months for a decision. A man willing to give gifts and cultivate a powerful patron receives an answer in a week. What lesson does everyone watching learn? Over time, the system begins selecting people in reverse. Not necessarily the people best at doing the work, but the people best at operating outside formal procedure. That may be the greatest damage created by Heshen-style power. It teaches officials to believe that rules are mainly for people without connections. The broader administrative problems of Qianlong's final years cannot all be blamed on Heshen. But Heshen became their most visible symbol. And no matter how large his fortune or network became, his entire system of security still rested on a single support that no amount of silver could replace. Qianlong. Now the real countdown begins. As long as Qianlong lived and continued to trust him, many of Heshen's problems would remain problems. They would not become fatal crimes. But Qianlong could not live forever. As the emperor grew older, that fact became a countdown everyone could see and almost no one dare discuss openly. Earlier in life, Qianlong had said that he did not wish to reign longer than his grandfather, the Qing Emperor, whose reign lasted 61 years. By the 60th year of his own reign, Qianlong had to decide whether he would keep that promise. He did. He designated his 15th son, Yongyan, as crown prince, and the following year formally abdicated. Yongyan became the Qing Emperor. On paper, the Qing dynasty had new sovereign. In reality, power remained more complicated. Qianlong became Emperor Emeritus and continued to direct the government. Major military and political decisions still belonged to him. Qing wore the emperor's robes, but he did not yet possess the full power of an emperor. That strange period placed Heshen in an extremely sensitive position. Qianlong was old. His voice, energy, and physical condition had declined. He needed people around him who understood his habits and could quickly interpret what he intended. After decades of service, Heshen knew Qianlong's manner of expression exceptionally well. In many situations, he became one of the crucial intermediaries between the Emperor Emeritus and the outside government. What did that mean for Qing? It meant that although he was emperor in name, he often confronted a minister who understood the Emperor Emeritus better than he did, and who could influence the movement of information more effectively than many other officials. Heshen did not need to stand up and declare, "I intend to control the new emperor." The structure itself created conflict. The more Qing wanted to establish his own authority, the less he could ignore Heshen. The more Heshen depended on Qianlong, the less incentive he had to transfer influence voluntarily to Qing. The two men stood on a bridge that was growing narrower every year. As long as Qianlong remained between them, the bridge held. Once Qianlong disappeared, every accumulated contradiction would lose its buffer at once. And Heshen knew perfectly well who the future emperor was. The first of the 20 great crimes later announced against him concerned the succession itself. According to Qing's charge, the day before Qianlong formally announced Yongyan as crown prince, Heshen had already presented him with a ceremonial Rui scepter, as if trying to claim special credit for supporting the succession. Viewed today, that act may sound far less serious than stealing millions of taels. Inside an imperial court, it was extraordinarily sensitive. The choice of heir was among the most secret matters in the state. If a minister knew the result before the formal announcement and hurried to demonstrate support, what might the future emperor feel? Gratitude? Probably not. Suspicion, because it showed that Heshen knew too much, too early, and stood too close to the center of confidential power. Even more troubling, Qing had reportedly disliked Heshen long before taking full control. The draft history of Qing later says that while he was still a prince, Qing already knew Heshen to be treacherous but restrained himself because Qianlong was elderly. That description was written after the victor had destroyed his opponent, so it must be read with caution. But one fact is clear. Once Qing began ruling in his own right, Heshen could never retain exactly the same position he had held under Qianlong. The only question was when the confrontation would come. Heshen appears to have continued betting his fate on Qianlong. After Qing's accession, he kept receiving major responsibilities. In the second year of Jiaqing, he was again involved with the Board of Punishments and Board of Revenue. In the third year, he received further noble advancement for his part in military administration. After Ague died, few officials of comparable seniority remained who could challenge Heshen over the long term. Palace Museum material describes him at this point as the foremost minister of the Great Qing. It was probably the highest point of his life. And the edge of the cliff, late Qianlong military campaigns still consumed enormous amounts of money. Warfare in Sichuan, Hubei, Shaanxi, and surrounding regions dragged on, and military expenditure continued to rise. Frontline commanders, provincial officials, supply systems, and reimbursement procedures became entangled in complex interests. The draft history of Qing later placed some responsibility for prolonged military failure and waste on commanders connected to Heshen. That accusation must be read in the political context of Jiaqing's later destruction of him, but it reflects an important reality. By the end of Qianlong's reign, Heshen was deeply entangled in the interests surrounding major military and fiscal affairs. A dispatch reaching the emperor one day earlier could change a general's fate. A delay of several days could give someone time to explain a defeat. A reimbursement approved quickly might allow tens or hundreds of thousands of taels, or more, to disappear into approved accounts. If the reimbursement was rejected and reopened, enormous deficits might be exposed. When one man could influence information and understood finance at the same time, his power was not merely a matter of having a high rank. He could influence time itself. And in politics, time itself is a form of interest. That helps explain why several of Jiaqing's later charges against Heshen do not appear to concern direct theft at all. They accuse him of delaying military dispatches, monopolizing the Board of Revenue, removing registered Grand Council personnel, and concealing official business. What Jiaqing wanted to eliminate was not merely an obscenely wealthy private individual. He wanted to eliminate a man who had acquired too much personal control over the state's information and personnel systems. If we look only at the legend of 800 million taels, we miss the central political meaning of the purge. After the 60th year of Qianlong's reign, Heshen's family also suffered several losses. His younger brother Helen, who had risen through military service, died around the first year of Jiaqing. Heshen's wife, Lady Feng, died roughly a year before he himself was executed. The woman who had shared the difficult years of his youth never lived to see the day his household was confiscated. Those private losses did not immediately weaken his political position. In the third year of Jiaqing, he still stood at the summit of power. But by the winter of that year, Qianlong's health was declining rapidly. For the entire court, the question was no longer whether the Emperor Emeritus would die. It was when. Everyone knew that the moment he did, the entire balance of power would be reshuffled. Heshen knew it too, but he had no easy escape. Could he have saved his life by resigning all of his offices, withdrawing from the center of government, and disappearing before Qianlong died? We cannot know. Perhaps Jiaqing would still have reopened the old cases. But for a man who had lived at the center of power for decades, voluntary retreat is often far harder than it appears from the outside. Power is not only other people obeying you. It changes how you understand yourself. When dozens of memorials cross your desk every day, when people constantly request audiences, when the emperor summons you for decisions, it becomes difficult to imagine waking up one morning and finding that all of it has vanished. On the third day of the first lunar month in the fourth year of Jiaqing, Qianlong died. Political time in Beijing reset to zero. For the previous 3 years, Jiaqing had been emperor, but he had not been the sole source of supreme authority. Now, for the first time, he truly ruled. And the first great problem he confronted was not a new war. It was not a nationwide institutional reform. It was Heshen. Later generations often say that Jiaqing waited 3 years. That phrase simplifies a complicated relationship, but captures the central fact. While Qianlong lived, Jiaqing had no realistic ability to openly destroy his father's most trusted minister. The moment Qianlong died, that limitation disappeared. More importantly, Jiaqing had to move quickly. Why not investigate slowly and carefully? Because Heshen had spent more than 20 years operating at the center of government. If given time, who might he contact? Which account books might disappear? Which assets could his family move? Which former clients might wait to see what happened? Even if Heshen had no ability to rebel, the mere question, does the new emperor really dare to touch him, could weaken Jiaqing's authority at the very moment he finally acquired it. This was not an ordinary anti-corruption investigation. It was a transfer of power in which speed itself determined success. During the first days after Qianlong's death, Jiaqing managed the imperial mourning ceremonies while simultaneously cutting Heshen away from authority. Around the 8th day of the first lunar month, officials began submitting concentrated accusations against him. Heshen was dismissed, arrested, imprisoned. His property was sealed and confiscated. For more than 20 years, one of Heshen's greatest skills had been deciding how other people's cases should be framed before they reached the emperor. This time, the case bore his own name. He no longer stood in the Grand Council, where he could adjust the wording. He no longer had time to tell Lu Quan to remove every questionable structure. He could no longer wait for Qianlong's anger to cool. The protector who had repeatedly pulled him back from the edge of punishment now lay in the imperial coffin. For the first time, Heshen stood exposed before the machinery of judgment, and before an emperor who had already decided that he was a problem. That is why speed became part of Jiaqing's politics. What does a new emperor fear most? Not a corrupt minister who has obviously fallen. He fears an old power broker whose fall has not yet been made unmistakable. As long as Heshen sat in the Grand Council for one more day, provincial officials could wonder, whose instructions actually matter now? As long as people continued entering the gates of Heshen's mansion, the bureaucracy could wonder, does the new emperor still intend to use him? That uncertainty alone could weaken Jiaqing. So an answer had to be given before everyone had time to wait and see. Qianlong died on the 3rd day of the first lunar month. Around the 8th, Heshen was arrested. On the 16th, the 20 great crimes were announced. On the 18th, he was ordered to die. That is not the timetable of an ordinary judicial proceeding. It is the timetable of a regime transition. Heshen did not even have time for a new protector to emerge. There would be none. His son was an imperial son-in-law, but possessed no independent political power. His brother Helen was already dead. Most protégés and former allies were interested first in saving themselves. Among the senior Manchu and Han officials, remarkably few possessed enough personal loyalty to Heshen to confront the emperor on his behalf. A man could own millions of taels of silver. He could not purchase someone willing to challenge the sovereign for him at a moment like this. That is the deepest irony of Heshen's wealth. Gold can buy service. It cannot buy legitimacy. It can buy access to power. It cannot buy power itself. Heshen had profited for 20 years from moving between those two things. In the end, he confused them. He may have believed that a huge network of relationships was security, but that network functioned only in the sunlight of Qianlong's favor. Once the sun set, the lines broke. Jiaqing could move so quickly for another reason. Heshen's power looked massive from the outside, but it had a hollow center. Many people feared him. Many people needed him. That did not mean anyone was willing to oppose the emperor for him. We should also remember that Heshen's corruption did not mean he controlled the entire Qianlong government. Qianlong remained the absolute political center. Agui, Wang Jie, Dong Gao, and other senior ministers possessed influence of their own. Provincial governors general belonged to complex networks and factions. Heshen was enormously powerful, but he was not an independent shadow emperor who had replaced Qianlong. Later labels describing him as a second emperor are better understood as exaggerations of his influence. If Heshen had truly controlled the Manchu and Han elite and commanded an independent military bloc, Jiaqing could never have arrested him so easily in a matter of days. That point is crucial. Heshen had great power. He did not have his own political army. What he possessed was a network of dependency. Networks like that can look enormous while the patron is favored. When the patron falls, they collapse with astonishing speed. Because most people were not really following Heshen. They were following the Qianlong power that stood behind him. The moment Qianlong died, the foundation that gave the network value disappeared. Jiaqing later reportedly asked a minister familiar with Grand Council affairs whether rumors that Heshen had rebellious intentions were true. The answer was direct. A man who genuinely intends to rebel must first win people's hearts. Yet among the Manchu and Han officials, almost no one was prepared to die for Heshen. Even if he had secretly entertained such thoughts, few would have followed him. That conversation reveals the true nature of his power. Everyone fears you. That does not mean everyone loves you. Everyone needs favors from you. That certainly does not mean everyone is willing to die for you. Power and loyalty are not the same thing. So when Jiaqing arrested Heshen, there was virtually no organized resistance. Yesterday, he had seemed like a massive tree casting shade over half the bureaucracy. Today, the root was cut, and everyone standing beneath it simply walked away. That may tell us more about the limits of his power than the legend of 800 million tales ever could. After Heshen's arrest, Jiaqing quickly published the 20 Great Crimes. Read one by one. They form something like a map of the power Heshen had accumulated over more than 2 decades. The first charge concerned the crown prince. The day before Qianlong officially announced Yongyan as heir, Heshen allegedly presented him with a Rui scepter and acted as though he deserved credit for supporting his succession. To an ordinary person, that might look like flattering the future boss one day early. Inside an imperial monarchy, it touched the most sensitive political secret in the state. Knowing the identity of the heir before the formal announcement meant standing very close to the highest level of decision-making. Worse, Heshen's gesture could be read as implying, "I helped you obtain this throne." That is exactly the kind of implication an emperor cannot tolerate. A minister must never suggest that the sovereign's right to rule partly came from him. That is why the charge came first. The second and third charges concerned riding on horseback and being carried in a sedan into places where Heshen was not supposed to go so far without dismounting. These details can sound trivial today. At the time, they expressed rank and political order. The Forbidden City and Yuanminjuan were not ordinary office complexes. Rules governing who had to dismount, where a sedan chair could pass, and which gate a certain rank could enter all carried political meaning. After years of favor, Heshen had received many exceptional privileges. He had gradually learned to treat exceptions as normal. Jiaqing now reinterpreted those exceptions as arrogance and transgression. The fourth charge accused him of taking a palace woman as a secondary wife. Again, the issue was not private romance in the modern sense. It concerned the legal status of palace personnel, the boundary between the inner and outer court, and the order of imperial authority. The fifth charge reached the real administrative heart of the case. Heshen was accused of deliberately delaying military dispatches and concealing information. Why did military reports matter so much? Because the empire was at war. A single day on the front could mean the movement of thousands of soldiers, the expenditure of hundreds of thousands of taels, and the rise or destruction of a commander. If military information could not reach the emperor promptly without passing through the judgment of one man, that man possessed power exceeding the simple words written in his job description. By charging Heshen with suppressing military reports, Jiaqing was really accusing him of controlling the emperor's field of vision. The sixth and seventh charges concerned Heshen's behavior, while Qianlong was seriously ill. Jiaqing accused him of failing to display sufficient grief and reverence toward the sick emperor emeritus, and of making comments about Qianlong's handwriting and handling of memorials that were inappropriate for a subject. These charges sound emotional. That is precisely the point. The case was never only about money. Jiaqing was constructing a moral story about his father. Qianlong had favored you beyond measure. Yet in his final illness, you failed to show the humility and gratitude expected of you. So Heshen was not only criminal, he was ungrateful. In a traditional ruler-minister relationship, ingratitude toward imperial favor was an extremely serious accusation. Almost every legitimate form of power Heshen possessed had come from Qianlong. The greater the favor, the greater the moral weight of betraying it. The eighth charge accused Heshen of monopolizing financial reimbursements through the Board of Revenue. This charge is especially important. Reimbursement sounds boring, but in wars and major construction projects, it is one of the places where enormous sums can become almost impossible to verify. A frontline army reports how much grain, how many horses, and how much equipment it used. A provincial government reports how much silver it advanced. Eventually, someone at the center must audit the claims. When the figures become huge and the evidence comes from distant provinces, item-by-item verification is extremely difficult. The person who controls the reimbursement rules can decide which evidence is accepted, which deficit receives an explanation, which expense is questioned. Jiaqing accused Heshen of personally dominating Board of Revenue affairs, changing established procedures, and preventing other officials from participating in discussion. The key accusation was not that Heshen personally performed every calculation. It was that counterweights had disappeared. The ninth charge said he rejected and concealed a provincial memorial concerning robbery in Qinghai. The 10th accused him of expanding an imperial order concerning whether Mongol princes should come to Beijing after Qianlong's death. The timing of this charge was especially sensitive. From Jiaqing's perspective, it was almost as if the Emperor Emeritus is already dead, and you still think you can modify the Emperor's instructions yourself. How can new ruler tolerate that? The 11th and 12th charges concern appointments. Jiaqing named officials connected to Heshen through marriage, patronage, or household ties. He accused him of promoting men who had once served as tutors in the Heshen household and of removing names from Grand Council personnel lists at will. If financial control brought Heshen wealth, personnel control gave him the future. Money received today can be spent and disappear. A man whose career you advanced may still remember 10 years later who made that advancement possible. That is why powerful ministers care about more than silver. They care about positions. An office can continue producing returns for years. The 13th and 14th charges concerned Heshen's residence and tomb complex exceeding permitted standards. This was power expressed through space. While alive, he lived in surroundings that appeared increasingly royal. The tomb he prepared for death was also accused of using a scale beyond the proper rank of a minister. For Jiaqing, buildings transformed Heshen's expanding sense of status into visible evidence. A minister could deny receiving a particular gift. He could not hide a grand mahal inside his sleeve. The 15th and 16th charges concerned pearls and precious stones. One of the most symbolic accusations was that some of Heshen's large pearls and jewels were greater in size and number than objects normally reserved for imperial use. The exact monetary value of every object was not the point. The politically explosive phrase was greater than those in the palace. In a monarchy, the greatest danger was not simply that a minister was rich. It was that the minister's wealth began to make him look more imperial than an ordinary subject was allowed to look. The 17th and 18th charges finally moved directly into gold and silver. Silver in clothing allegedly worth more than 10 million. Gold concealed inside walls. Gold hidden in private storerooms. Millions of tales of silver buried underground. Why hide wealth inside walls and cellars? Those details are among the most visually powerful parts of the later story. We cannot reconstruct the exact physical sequence of every discovery, but imagine the confiscation of a huge residence. Room after room is sealed. Storerooms are unlocked. Chests and cabinets are inventoried. Contracts are collected. Jewelry is sorted. Suspicious walls, chambers, and concealed spaces are examined more closely. For the Heshen household, this was not simply the government carrying away a few boxes of silver. The state was taking control of an entire private economic system. The 19th charge concerned pawn shops and money shops and accused Heshen of competing with common people for profit. That accusation belongs very specifically to its historical setting. The Qing state did not prohibit every official family from owning property or commercial interests. But when one of the most powerful ministers in the empire used his status while operating financial businesses, critics could easily accuse him of converting political power into private profit. Jiaqing needed to establish that Heshen's fortune had not come only from official salary and imperial gifts. It had grown through the use of power in the marketplace. The 20th and final charge returned to Lu Quan, a household servant possessing more than 200,000 taels worth of property and an enormous pearl bracelet. Placed at the end of the list, the effect was devastating. If even the servant was this rich, what kind of interest network had grown around the master? And there the 20 great crimes ended. From the secret of the crown prince to rules at palace gates, from military dispatches to the board of revenue, from appointments to mansions, from jewels to hidden silver, and finally to a household servant. The list surrounded almost every public and private aspect of Heshen's life. That is one reason it has remained so vivid for more than 2 centuries. It contains not only abstract accusations, but objects. A Rui scepter, Shoid, military dispatches, Nama timber, pearls, gold, cellars, pawn shops, and at the end of the story, a strip of white silk. Once history becomes an object, abstract power acquires a visible shape. That is why the charges are so effective. It is not only that the numbers are large. Each material object allows power and wealth to be seen. To say, Heshen was extraordinarily rich is still abstract. But move the camera through the courtyards of his mansion, past Nanmu interiors, locked storerooms, silver ingots, property deeds, pearl court necklaces, and then cut to a strip of white silk in a prison cell. And the whole narrative closes like a circle. Heshen spent his life accumulating more and more things. At the end, the things left to him became fewer and fewer. When he first entered the palace, he had education, ambition, and opportunity. After winning favor, he gained offices, then noble titles, a mansion, commercial businesses, land, jewels, a marriage connection to the imperial family. In prison, all of them were stripped away. First, the offices disappeared, then freedom. Finally, even tomorrow. That extreme reversal is what makes Heshen's story so compelling. And when we look back at his youth, the contrast becomes even sharper. The orphan boy studying in a government academy almost certainly understood what it felt like to lack money and protection. Did that experience directly cause his later obsession with wealth? We have no evidence that allows us to diagnose his psychology that neatly. One of the most common abuses in writing about historical people is to discover childhood hardship and then announce. That is why he became corrupt. Human beings do not work mechanically. Millions of people endure poverty and never become Heshen. What we can reasonably say is that his youth taught him early that status and resources mattered. The political world he later entered gave that sensitivity enormous room to expand. First, perhaps, he pursued security, then position, then indispensability. Eventually, he may no longer have known how much wealth would ever feel like enough. That is the question greed can never answer. Why does a man who already owns millions still want more? Because at a certain point, money no longer means consumption. No one can eat 1,000 banquets in a day. No one can sleep in 100 rooms at once. Additional silver represents control, options, family security, and the illusion that I will never lose everything again. Heshen's fate proved the opposite. More money does not always mean more safety. And now we can finally return to the most famous number in the story. Where did the figure of 800 million taels come from? It comes largely from later confiscation lists, private notes, and retellings. Different versions assign wildly different quantities of gold, silver, land, pawn shops, businesses, and treasures to Heshen. Some later calculations convert all of these assets into values reaching hundreds of millions of taels, sometimes as high as 800 million. Modern Palace Museum material, when discussing this famous figure, explicitly identifies the 800 million taels as a popular legend and notes that it is clearly exaggerated. That point matters. A strong historical story does not need false numbers in order to be shocking. The scale of Heshen's reliably documented wealth is already extraordinary. There is no reason to turn the most inflated version into unquestioned fact simply because it sounds dramatic. At the same time, the survival of the 800 million tael legend for more than 2 centuries is itself part of the history. The number survived because it fits the public image of Heshen. Here was the favorite minister of an aging emperor, a man who influenced finance and personnel, a man whose household was genuinely found to contain large quantities of gold, silver, jewelry, business assets, and structures criticized as exceeding proper rank. A man who collapsed almost immediately after the new emperor acquired real power. For popular memory, the easiest way to compress all of that into a single sentence was to attach an astronomical number to his fortune. 800 million taels is more dramatic than a discussion of institutions. The number grows, the story becomes neater, and eventually the famous saying emerges. When Heshen fell, Jiaqing ate his fill. It is a perfect popular ending. Real history is not so tidy. Jiaqing certainly acquired an enormous amount of property through the confiscation. But that did not solve the Qing state's financial problems. Wars in Sichuan, Hubei, and other regions continued. Military expenditure remained high. Provincial deficits, river control costs, corruption, and structural weaknesses did not disappear because one power minister was dead. No matter how much silver lies inside one mansion, it cannot fill every fiscal hole in a vast empire. So the Heshen case should not be told as a simple fairy tale. A wicked official stole 800 million taels. A good emperor killed him. The state became healthy again. If history worked that easily, the Qing Empire would have faced far fewer problems afterward. And the way Jiaqing handled the aftermath shows that the operation was not simply a hunt for treasure. There's another detail that is often overlooked. Jiaqing did not intend to prosecute everyone who had ever dealt with Heshen. At first glance, that may seem strange. If Heshen truly maintained a huge network of interests, why not follow every connection and arrest every official associated with him? Because Jiaqing's goal was not to throw the entire bureaucracy into panic. His immediate goal was to complete the transfer of power. A ruler who had only just gained full authority could not realistically declare that every official who had interacted with the most powerful minister of the previous 20 years was now a criminal conspirator. Government might stop functioning. And during the years of Heshen's dominance, maintaining some relationship with him did not necessarily mean participating in corruption on the same scale. Some officials gave gifts opportunistically. Some acted from fear. Some simply had official business that necessarily passed through the Grand Council. To tear the entire network apart might have cost more than leaving most of it in place. Jiaqing therefore made clear that officials previously recommended by Heshen or known to have frequented his residence would not automatically be investigated forever if they corrected themselves. When additional accusations claimed Heshen possessed still more hidden wealth, Jiaqing even moved to stop the case from expanding indefinitely. That shows how clearly he understood his political objective. Destroy the center. Do not allow the case to consume the entire state. As political technique, that was colder and more controlled than simple rage. Once Heshen fell, everyone understood immediately. The new emperor truly held power. Some administrative habits associated with Heshen began to be reversed. Procedures that had allowed information or copies of memorials to pass through additional channels were restricted. Jiaqing ordered that officials inside and outside the capital should be able to submit memorials directly to him without creating a new private gatekeeper. The symbolism was obvious. One of the central political problems of Qianlong's final years was the growth of too many filters between the emperor and the bureaucracy. If a ruler hears only the information most carefully selected to match his expectations, he can personally read hundreds of memorials every day and still drift farther from reality. In moving against Heshen, Jiaqing was also announcing, from now on, I will decide who controls the entrance to information. While all of this was happening, Heshen was sitting in a prison under the board of punishments waiting for the result. Only a little more than 2 weeks separated Qianlong's death from Heshen's order to commit suicide. They may have been the longest 2 weeks of his life. For decades, he had known when the emperor rose in the morning, when the Grand Council entered for audience, how a provincial memorial traveled to Beijing, how it became an imperial order. He had even possessed enough influence over timing to make other people experience power through delay or acceleration. Now he could only wait. Each day outside, more of his property was registered. Each day, more accusations reached Jiaqing. Each day, the relationships he had spent decades building became less useful. The people who once lined up at his gate stopped coming. Those who once boasted about knowing Heshen began explaining that they had never known him very well at all. People who had used his name to get business done probably began thinking first about which old letters needed to disappear. That is the cruelest moment in the fall of a power minister. At the height of influence, friends seem to be everywhere. Once power vanishes, you discover how many of them were only strangers with an excellent sense of direction. The 15th day of the first lunar month was the Lantern Festival. Beijing should have been full of lights, reunions, and celebration. Heshen spent it in prison. His collected poetry preserves verses written while he was confined. They no longer sound like the confident voice of a grand counselor or a grand secretary. They sound like a man around 50 suddenly realizing that more than 20 years of accumulation may disappear within days. He writes of life as a dream, of spring that cannot be seen behind prison walls, of the possibility that very little life remains. Do these poems prove that Heshen sincerely repented? No. A man can be sad at the prospect of death without admitting that everything he did in life was wrong. But the poems allow the human being beneath the legend of 800 million tales to appear for a moment. He was afraid to die. He remembered the past. He understood that he might never walk through that door again. On the 16th day, the 20 great crimes were formally announced. Senior officials discussed the appropriate punishment. Some argued that Heshen's crimes were serious enough to justify the severest treatment, even execution by Ling Qi. Jiaqing refused. His stated reasoning was that Heshen had, after all, been employed and favored by Qianlong for many years and had served as one of the most senior ministers of state. So the emperor reduced the final form of punishment. Heshen would be ordered to kill himself. This was not a pardon. It merely transformed a public execution into death inside confinement. On the 18th day of the first lunar month, a length of white silk was delivered to Heshen. Later literature turned this scene into countless dramatic versions. Some stories say the 10th princess knelt before her imperial brother and begged for mercy. Some say Heshen laughed when he saw the silk. Others say that even at the end, he was thinking about his gold and silver. Research associated with Prince Kung's mansion has specifically cautioned that the famous story of the 10th princess pleading for Heshen to be granted an intact body is not directly confirmed by reliable historical evidence. We do not need to invent a final theatrical scene for him. The facts are dramatic enough. A man who entered the gate of heavenly purity in his mid-20s, joined the Grand Council at 27, held multiple core offices in his 30s, and became the foremost minister of the empire in his 40s, was ordered to die roughly 15 days after Qianlong's death. From a summit of power to death. Not a year, not a month, half a month. Popular memory remembers the strip of white silk. But the thing that truly killed Heshen was not a piece of cloth. It was the end of Qianlong's life. Heshen's entire political structure possessed one fatal flaw. It had no legitimacy independent of Qianlong. His offices, of course, were legal offices of the state. But the force that allowed him to overpower colleagues came from Qianlong's personal confidence. That confidence caused mistakes to be forgiven. It allowed Heshen to remain in office after demotion. It allowed him to accumulate overlapping responsibilities across multiple institutions. It made other officials think twice before challenging him. But personal favor cannot be inherited. A new emperor has no obligation to inherit his father's affection for a minister. In fact, the more dependent the father had been on that minister, the more likely the son might see him as an obstacle to establishing a new reign. Heshen's most successful strategy in life was becoming the man Qianlong needed most. His greatest strategic failure was failing to build any safe exit for a world in which Qianlong no longer existed. That gives his life the shape of a classical tragedy. The same ability that lifted him upward eventually trapped him at the top. He was brilliant at reading people, so he understood Qianlong better than almost anyone. Because he understood Qianlong so well, he became increasingly dependent on Qianlong. Because he became dependent on Qianlong, he could not truly shift his loyalty and political position toward Jiaqing. Because he could not shift, every piece of power he had accumulated became a threat in the eyes of the new emperor the moment Qianlong died. Heshen's son Fengsheninde was not executed with his father. Again, the 10th princess mattered. Fengsheninde was married to one of Qianlong's most beloved daughters. Jiaqing still cared for his sister and had little reason to destroy her completely because of Heshen's crimes. Fengsheninde was allowed to retain part of his status for a time. He later faced additional punishment after items considered inappropriate for a subject were discovered during the confiscation, but he did not share his father's fate. Heshen's residence also changed hands. Part of the property was later granted to Prince Qing Yonglin. Decades afterward, it became the residence of Prince Kung Yisin, which is why it is now known as Prince Kung's mansion. That courtyard is fascinating because different layers of time occupy the same physical space. A corridor you walk through today may have seen Heshen at the height of his pride, then officials arriving to confiscate his property, then another princely household moving in, then still later political figures of the Qing dynasty. Visitors often search for the secret of Heshen's hidden treasure. The more interesting history lies in the layers of rebuilding and reuse themselves. Consider the western section of the mansion and its famous Nanmu interiors, later known as Shijin Studio. The materials and design are extremely refined. When Jiaqing listed Heshen's crimes, he specifically accused the residents of excessive luxury and of exceeding permitted rank. Nanmu rooms display interiors, partitions said to imitate the Ningxiu Palace and garden arrangements compared with imperial landscape design were all cited as evidence. Why would an emperor care so much about architecture? To a modern observer, it can sound absurd. So the house was decorated too lavishly. Why should that matter? Because in Qing imperial society, architecture was not merely aesthetic. Door forms, roof types, certain decorations, and spatial arrangements expressed hierarchy. The house you lived in announced who you were. If a minister increasingly built his residence according to forms associated with imperial status, Jiaqing could interpret it as more than wealth. It became evidence that Heshen had forgotten the boundary between minister and sovereign. The same logic applied to jewelry, clothing, and tomb construction. The 20 Great Crimes mentioned unusually numerous pearl bracelets, exceptionally large pearls and gemstones, and objects beyond the normal scale appropriate to a minister. Heshen's tomb complex in Jizhou was also accused of containing halls and underground passages beyond proper rank, and of being locally referred to as Heshen's mausoleum. The political meaning of those details mattered more than the market price of the jewels. Jiaqing was telling the empire, Heshen's problem was not simply that he took too much money. His lifestyle itself had begun approaching a level that did not belong to his subject. At the same time, we should read the 20 Great Crimes with some historical distance. They were political and legal accusations published during Jiaqing's purge. They were not a modern forensic audit. Several charges were grounded in values specific to an imperial hierarchy: riding in a certain place, entering a gate in a sedan chair, possessing pearls larger than those considered proper for one's rank. In a modern society, such acts would not be treated as major crimes. In that world, they all pointed toward the central accusation that a subject had exceeded his place. Likewise, the 20 Great Crimes were not a complete catalog of every questionable act in Heshen's life. They were a document designed to produce a rapid judgment and explain to the court why Heshen had to be removed. Understanding that does not weaken the history. It brings us closer to it. Jiaqing needed more than legal charges. He needed political persuasion. Qianlong had just died. If the new emperor immediately executed his father's most trusted minister without giving compelling reasons, people might interpret the action as a criticism of Qianlong himself. So Jiaqing's language was carefully constructed. The guilt belonged to Heshen. The benevolence belonged to Emperor Gaozong. Qianlong. The official story was that the late emperor had generously favored a minister who deceived and betrayed his trust. It was not that Qianlong had exercised catastrophically poor judgment for more than 20 years. That narrative protected the continuity and dignity of imperial rule. It allowed Jiaqing to destroy Heshen without openly attacking his father's legacy. That technique appears repeatedly in monarchical politics. Replace the man. Preserve the dignity of the institution. Heshen died, but the story around him did not. Jiaqing still had to explain to future generations why his father's most trusted minister became the first great enemy to be eliminated once he himself truly took power. Jiaqing did not erase Heshen's name from history. Quite the opposite. The new emperor needed that name. A new period often begins by announcing what was wrong with the old one. Heshen became the most visible answer. Roughly 15 years after Heshen's death, the official historiographical office submitted a draft biography of him. Jiaqing judged it too brief. In particular, he believed it failed to record adequately that Qianlong himself had repeatedly criticized Heshen during his lifetime and that Heshen had continued making serious mistakes. Officials responsible for the historical compilation were punished. That detail is revealing. Jiaqing did not only want to kill Heshen, he wanted to define Heshen. Future generations, in the emperor's view, needed to understand that this powerful minister had not been arbitrarily destroyed by a new reign. His faults had existed for years. Only Qianlong's generosity and repeated tolerance had allowed the situation to grow uncontrollable. That was politics. It was also historical writing. Victors do not only determine when a man dies, they often influence which side of him future generations see first. So when we talk about Heshen today, we are really dealing with three overlapping figures. First, the actual human being who lived through the Qianlong era. Second, the official image of the corrupt and treacherous minister constructed after Jiaqing's purge. Third, the super corrupt official created and enlarged over 2 centuries of novels, storytelling, television, and popular legend. All 3 layers combined to produce the Heshen most people recognize today. Take the famous saying, "When Heshen fell, Jiaqing ate his fill." It is perfect popular storytelling. In a few words, it gives you the man, the fall, and the fortune. But it can create a misleading impression that Jiaqing executed Heshen mainly because the state treasury was empty and the new emperor wanted his wealth. Reality was more complicated. Jiaqing certainly had no objection to confiscating an enormous fortune. But if money alone had been the goal, he could have seized the property and imprisoned Heshen for life. What made Heshen's rapid disappearance politically necessary was his accumulated control, his record of monopolizing authority, and the new emperor's need to establish a new order. Money was the most spectacular part of the case. It was not the entire cause. And once Heshen was gone, Jiaqing discovered the deeper problem. A man can be executed in 2 weeks. A political culture cannot. After Heshen's death, one of Jiaqing's first responses was to restore or alter administrative procedures that had allowed extra layers of filtering to grow around the throne. Some kinds of memorials had developed practices involving advance copies or consultation through the Grand Council. Heshen had been able to use those channels as private filters. Jiaqing demanded that officials in the capital and provinces be able to report directly to him. In essence, he was reclaiming the entrance to information. It was not a glamorous reform. It was fundamental. An emperor must hear the real world before he can govern the real world. And Jiaqing soon discovered something else. Killing Heshen was easy. Changing the entire bureaucracy was hard. A man's house can be sealed in a single day. A political habit may survive for decades. Provincial treasury shortages did not repair themselves because Heshen died. Military reimbursements did not suddenly become transparent when the white silk tightened. Long-established interests in river works, the salt administration, grain transport, and other systems remain. Officials who had learned the usefulness of gifts did not forget how to give them. Officials accustomed to using personal connections simply looked for new connections. This is the illusion behind the idea that executing one spectacularly corrupt official can, by itself, eliminate corruption. A great prosecution can frighten people. It does not necessarily repair the environment that produced the offender. Heshen died quickly. Many of the conditions associated with his era did not die with him. That is why, looking back today, we should resist the temptation to stop the story at the satisfying moment when the villain finally receives punishment. If the story ends with the white silk, all we see is retribution. If we keep looking, we see institutions. For the same reason, blaming every problem of late Qianlong government on Heshen also distorts the story. To judge him fairly, we have to hold together 3 things: his genuine abilities, his genuine responsibility, and the political environment that allowed such concentrated power to survive for so long. Heshen was not the cause of every problem in the Qing Empire. He was more like a lesion in which deeper symptoms became unusually visible. Through him, we can see how power worked in Qianlong's final decades, and how an intensely personal relationship between ruler and minister could create efficiency in the short term, while weakening supervision in the long term. There are 2 opposite mistakes people make when judging Heshen. The first is to turn him into a monster with no abilities at all, to say that he achieved nothing, that he knew nothing, that every office came only from flattery. That cannot explain why he remained useful for so long, nor his performance in the Yunnan investigation, financial administration, multilingual documents, and complex government work. The second mistake is to romanticize his corruption simply because he was capable. Some people reverse the argument and say that Heshen was merely good at business, or that he made money for Qianlong and was therefore unfairly condemned. That does not withstand scrutiny either. Ability does not erase responsibility. The more capable someone is, the less plausible it becomes that he did not understand the consequences of what he was doing. The official charges and historical accounts of patronage, gifts, protection, monopolization of authority, and enormous private wealth show problems far beyond ordinary financial management or legal commercial activity. A mature interpretation should allow two facts to exist at the same time. Heshen was one of the most capable senior officials of the Qianlong era, and Heshen was also one of the most famous, extraordinarily wealthy, and deeply corrupt power ministers in Qing history. The first fact makes the second more important, not less. If a foolish man becomes corrupt, greed alone may be enough to explain him. When an intelligent man becomes corrupt enough to dominate an entire court, we also have to ask why the system failed to stop him sooner. That gives the title, "The Greatest Corrupt Official in Chinese History," a different meaning. In truth, the word greatest is almost impossible to rank scientifically. Across thousands of years of Chinese history, dynasties used different currencies, operated on different fiscal scales, and left behind very different quantities of records. Some officials directly embezzled state grain and silver. Others accumulated wealth through land and commerce. Some sold offices. In other cases, the numbers attached to a fortune cannot be verified at all. Trying to create an exact wealth ranking that places Heshen beside figures such as Yin Song, Lu Jin, or other notorious officials would therefore be misleading. A better way to understand the phrase is this: the greatest corrupt official is one of the most famous labels later generations attached to Heshen. And he became the symbol not only because he was rich, he became the symbol because his story feels almost perfectly complete. A difficult youth, early success, imperial recognition, a spectacular rise, real ability, expanding power. After Heshen died, his story only grew larger. His actual fortune, the official charges against him, court records, private writings, popular storytelling, novels, and television drama gradually piled on top of one another until they created the super corrupt official most people recognize today. So before reaching a final judgment, we need to separate several of the most popular legends from what the historical record can actually support. Not to rehabilitate Heshen, but because the real history is already dramatic enough. There is no need to make it more exciting with invention. The sudden rise of a young imperial guard already invites legend. A minister who became immensely wealthy and then was destroyed the moment a new emperor took real power invites even more. Over generations, later writers filled in the gaps. Eventually, court records, private anecdotes, opera, fiction, and popular folklore became so tangled that many people no longer know which details can be verified and which are created simply because they make a better story. The classic example is the question of why Qianlong supposedly liked Heshen at first sight. Later tradition created several highly theatrical explanations. Some stories claim that Heshen resembled a woman Qianlong had once known in his youth. Others turn the meeting into something almost supernatural, as if the emperor saw him and felt a connection from a previous life. These stories are memorable. They work beautifully in fiction and on stage. Reliable historical evidence does not allow us to treat them as the real explanation for Heshen's rise. The facts we can confirm are actually more persuasive. Heshen was young, attractive in appearance, possessed a strong memory, had unusual linguistic and literary ability, and reacted quickly in government work. Around the 40th year of Qianlong's reign, he entered close imperial service and received a rapid succession of real administrative appointments. He then proved through the Yunnan investigation, financial affairs, and constant court work that he could complete difficult tasks assigned by the emperor. There is nothing mysterious about that path, and that is exactly why it matters. If Heshen rose only because he happened to look like someone from Qianlong's past, then his career becomes an accident. If he rose because his abilities, personality, and the emperor's needs fit together unusually well, then his career tells us something about the political system itself. A second misconception is that Heshen grew up in absolute destitution. He did lose his parents at a young age, and the brothers clearly experienced hardship. The official historical tradition even describes him as poor and without strong support in youth. But he was still born into a banner family. His father had held a relatively senior military post. The family possessed a hereditary title that Heshen could inherit. He did not rise from the streets of Beijing as a completely anonymous orphan and somehow become chief minister overnight. A more accurate picture is that of a banner youth whose family circumstances had declined, who still possessed access to education and hereditary office, but who had to turn those opportunities into a real career himself. That distinction may sound small. It changes the way we understand him. He was not born at the summit, but neither did he begin with nothing. He had openings, and he was exceptionally good at enlarging them. A third misconception is that the relationship between Qianlong and Heshen consisted of nothing but endless flattery. Flattery certainly existed. Palace-related materials describe Heshen as exceptionally deferential before Qianlong and as someone who knew the emperor's habits in great detail. But flattery alone still cannot explain why he was trusted with the Yunnan investigation, fiscal administration, Grand Council work, frontier affairs, the massive imperial library project, and many other complicated responsibilities. The most sophisticated form of courtly ingratiation is not repeating "Your Majesty is wise" after every sentence. It is making the ruler feel that whenever he wants something done, you can make it happen. That was Heshen's special talent. He combined competence with obedience, with ability but no submission. He might have become a formidable minister whom Qianlong respected but also feared. With submission but no ability, he might have remained only a favorite. The combination of both created the Heshen who gradually seemed impossible to replace. A fourth misconception is that every upright official at court spent every day openly fighting Heshen. Real government was not a stage play with fixed heroes and villains. Officials such as Qianfeng, Cao Shibao, and Yin Zhuangzi did confront problems connected with Heshen through specific cases or memorials. Senior statesmen such as Gu Wei, Wang Jie, and Zhu Gui had tense relations with him. But these men held different offices, pursued different careers, and did not spend every day of their lives plotting to bring down Heshen. A vast empire had frontier problems, grain transport, river control, criminal cases, appointments, tax disputes, and countless other matters every single day. Heshen could not divide the entire government neatly into my faction and the anti-Heshen faction. The real danger lay in the gray areas. A minister might oppose Heshen on one issue and have to cooperate with him on another. Someone might dislike him, but refuse to risk an accusation. Someone else might have benefited from Heshen's help without becoming his loyal follower. Many officials simply believed that maintaining a workable relationship with the center of power was common political sense. That reality is less satisfying than a simple battle between loyal ministers and an evil minister, but it is closer to history. A fifth misconception is that Jiaqing spent decades as a prince secretly constructing a perfect revenge plan against Heshen. The historical record does suggest that Jiaqing disliked him before becoming fully independent as emperor, and that he restrained himself while Qianlong lived. That does not mean every silence can be interpreted as part of a master plan. Jiaqing's greatest advantage was much simpler. He did not need to create an opportunity. Time would create one for him. Qianlong would eventually die. When that happened, imperial authority would inevitably transfer completely. A power minister whose position depended too heavily on the emperor emeritus would automatically become vulnerable. Jiaqing's great political skill was not decades of theatrical acting. It was that when the opportunity finally arrived, he did not hesitate. A sixth misconception is treating every later confiscation list as an original official document from the Jiaqing court. The most famous lists are often spectacularly detailed and extravagant. They contain gold and silver, pearls and gemstones, shops and land, all with enormous values. Some items may derive from early material. Others clearly changed through repeated copying and retelling. The contradictions between different versions are themselves a warning. Because the historical Heshen is already extraordinary, he does not need another layer of mythology. Once those legends are peeled away, the real figure actually becomes sharper. He did not acquire everything through a single magical encounter. He spent more than 20 years building it. And once we returned the popular legends to their proper place, we can return to the question from the beginning with a much better answer. Heshen was not killed simply because he stole 800 million tales. His story matters because his ability, Qianlong's trust, institutional imbalance, expanding wealth, and the transition from one emperor to another all converged on the same ending. Wealth accumulated. The family married into the imperial house. Officials flocked to his gate. His protector died. The new emperor acted. 15 days later, he had fallen. The white silk ended the story. Few historical lives contain such a perfect symmetry between ascent and collapse. Because from the moment we understand that Qianlong must eventually die, Heshen's career contains an invisible countdown. Every new promotion brings more danger. The more successful he becomes, the harder we know he will fall. When Qianlong joins Heshen's family to the 10th princess, we see extraordinary honor. We can also see another knot tightening. When Heshen becomes Grand Secretary of the Wenhua Hall, we see the summit. We also see fewer possible exits. When Jiaqing becomes emperor, but Qianlong continues to rule as Emperor Emeritus, the suspense is no longer. Will Heshen fall? It becomes, how many days can he survive after Qianlong dies? The answer is astonishingly short. That is the strongest tension in the entire story. We can almost understand Heshen's life as 3 ledgers. The first is the ledger of ability. Education, memory, language, writing, and administrative speed earned Qianlong's attention. The second is the ledger of power. Office by office, connection by connection, and eventually through marriage into the imperial family, Heshen created influence that became increasingly difficult to challenge. The third is the ledger of wealth. He converted the opportunities created by power, gifts, business, investment, patronage, and illicit benefit into private property. The first 2 ledgers made the third grow faster and faster. But in the end, there was a 4th ledger, the political ledger. After Qianlong died, Jiaqing closed the account all at once. All of Heshen's wealth combined could not pay what that final account demanded. Once everything he had accumulated for protection became evidence against him, another question naturally appears. Could he have left the stage earlier and avoided the ending? When wealth depends on power, the collapse of power transforms wealth into evidence. The mansion he once displayed with pride became part of the charges. His finest jewels became part of the charges. His most profitable pawn shops became part of the charges. Gold hidden in sidewalls, concealed precisely because it seemed safer there, became some of the hardest property to explain once inspectors found it. 20 years of building security reversed direction in 15 days. That is what makes Heshen's fall worth studying. It was not simply a rich man becoming poor. Everything he had built to protect himself suddenly became material that could be used against him. Could he have avoided that ending? That is perhaps the last great counterfactual before the story closes. What if Heshen had taken less and remained only an able minister? What if, after Jiaqing's accession, he had voluntarily surrendered his positions in the Grand Council and Board of Revenue and kept only a prestigious but less threatening title? What if, several years before Qianlong's death, he had distributed much of his private fortune among relatives or deliberately repaired his relationship with the future emperor? We have survived? We do not know. History did not run the experiment twice. But Jiaqing's actions suggest one thing with near certainty. Even if the legendary scale of Heshen's fortune had never existed, it would have been extremely difficult for him to preserve the same level of power he enjoyed under Qianlong. The conflict between old and new imperial authority was structural. For Jiaqing to become emperor in more than name, he had to prove that the Grand Council, the Board of Revenue, personnel appointments, and official information ultimately answered to him. Heshen's continued presence at the same level of power represented the unfinished survival of the previous political order. If he had withdrawn early enough, perhaps must be executed could have become must lose power. But that is only speculation. What actually happened is that he stayed until the end. Why is it so difficult for powerful ministers to retire voluntarily? For an ordinary official, retirement means losing an office. For a power broker, retirement can mean losing protection. Heshen had extraordinary wealth. He also had extraordinary numbers of potential enemies. The moment he left Qianlong's side, would old accusations return? Would cases he had suppressed be reopened? Would people he had pushed aside seek revenge? The more problems a powerful man accumulates, the less safe retirement becomes. The less safe retirement becomes, the more tightly he must hold power. The more tightly he holds power, the more threatening he becomes to the next ruler. This is a classic political trap. By the end, even if Heshen understood the danger, the structure of his own survival forced him to continue forward. So Heshen was not simply killed by greed. He tied his wealth, his political security, and the life of Qianlong into a single knot. While Qianlong lived, the knot held. The moment Qianlong died, it tightened around Heshen himself. And to understand that, we cannot talk only about Heshen. We also have to talk about Qianlong. A minister cannot hold astonishing power for more than 2 decades through his own actions alone. The ruler bears responsibility too. Later generations often found it convenient to place every problem of Qianlong's final years on Heshen. That preserves the image of a glorious emperor. The great ruler remained great. He was simply deceived in old age by a wicked minister. But if one official receives extraordinary authority for more than 20 consecutive years, the emperor cannot be entirely absolved. Every major promotion Heshen received required Qianlong's approval. Qianlong placed him in the Grand Council. Qianlong used him in the imperial household department. Qianlong allowed him to manage finance, appointments, and customs. Qianlong chose to retain him after accusations. Qianlong decided that the scandal involving his household servant did not justify destroying his career. Even if Heshen was genuinely skilled at deception, it is impossible to explain more than 20 years as a single minister fooling an emperor who still personally handled government every day. A more accurate interpretation is that Qianlong repeatedly judged Heshen's usefulness to be greater than the danger he posed. For a long time, that decision may indeed have made administration more efficient. It also weakened ordinary supervision. The more strongly an emperor trusts one person, the harder it becomes for everyone else to supervise that person. As the emperor grows older and depends more heavily on familiar servants, the risk grows. That makes Heshen's story a mirror of Qianlong's late style of rule. The mirror reflects more than one corrupt official. It reflects an emperor's preference for efficiency, loyalty, and personal control. Qianlong had lived through one of the Qing Empire's periods of greatest power. He had enormous confidence in himself and in his own judgment of people. He was accustomed to believing that he could see through his ministers. For a ruler like that, admitting that the man he trusted most had become a major problem would not have been easy, because it would also mean admitting that his own personnel judgment had failed. The more confidence someone has, the more difficult it can become to reverse a decision after years of investment. Today, we might describe that psychology as an unwillingness to accept sunk costs. The 18th century did not have the term. The mind worked the same way. After employing a man for 10 years, an emperor may think, "I have used him for a decade. Do you really think I do not understand him?" 5 more years pass. Another accusation arrives. The emperor thinks the previous accusations also failed to prove anything decisive. By the time the problem becomes too large to ignore, the emperor himself is very old. Heshen survived for so long not only because he hid things well. He survived because Qianlong became increasingly willing to believe that his original judgment had been correct. Jiaqing began from the opposite position. He did not need to justify why his father once found Heshen useful. He only needed to explain why he himself could no longer use him. So the same man appeared completely different in the eyes of 2 emperors. To Qianlong, Heshen was an old minister who worked smoothly and understood him. To Jiaqing, he was a surviving node of the previous reign that had to be dismantled. Heshen had not changed overnight. The emperor had changed. That is one of the cruel uncertainties of highly personal monarchy. A formal office can continue. Personal favor can disappear before sunrise. Heshen's prison poetry suggests that by the end, he too may finally have understood this. His final reflections on life have been quoted repeatedly by later generations. We do not need to turn them into prophecy or add mystical meaning. A man who knows he may die tomorrow will naturally look back over 50 years and feel that life has passed like a dream. The deeper irony is that Heshen had spent his career calculating. He calculated money, people, the emperor's moods, the best moment to speak, which case needed speed, which case needed delay. But in the end, he miscalculated the one variable no one can control: time. Qianlong would grow old. Qianlong would die. Any power built around a single human being has an expiration date. That may have been the greatest accounting error of Heshen's life. Now return one final time to the imaginary treasury from the beginning of this story. At first, we asked, was there really 800 million taels inside? After following Heshen's entire life, a more important question appears. How could one official accumulate such extraordinary wealth and remain inside the highest decision-making institutions of the state for so long? The number is only the doorway. Inside the room is power. Heshen's wealth was astonishing, but his greatest asset was never silver. It was Qianlong's trust. That trust carried him into the Grand Council. It put state finance in his hands. It allowed him to survive punishment after punishment. It connected his son to Qianlong's beloved 10th princess. It forced officials across the empire to calculate how close or how far this should stand from Heshen for more than 20 years. And what Jiaqing confiscated was not only the Heshen household. He was confiscating the political value of a trust whose owner was already dead. That is why, when the white silk entered the prison on the 18th day of the first lunar month, the most valuable thing Heshen had ever possessed was already gone. Not the gold, not the pearls, not the mansion. The man who could still say, "Keep him." Qianlong was gone. Millions of taels could not save Heshen. His noble title could not save him. His former status as Grand Counselor could not save him. Even his family connection to the imperial house could protect his son better than it could protect him. Everything that had once looked unbreakable suddenly became paper. That is why Heshen's ending retains such powerful drama more than 200 years later. We know where he is going. So the more successful his early life becomes, the more clearly we feel danger approaching. At 26, he enters the gate of heavenly purity. At 27, the Grand Council. Around 30, responsibilities in finance, customs, the imperial guard, and palace administration begin piling together. At 31, the Yunnan investigation deepens Qianlong's confidence in him, while his son becomes engaged to the 10th princess. In his 30s, he becomes a board president, assistant grand secretary, and then grand secretary of the Wenhua Hall. After 40, noble titles, honors, the mansion, commercial assets, and private wealth grow together. In his late 40s, Jiaqing becomes emperor, but Qianlong still rules and Heshen remains in the center of power. Around 49, he rises to one of the highest ranks available to a subject. Around 50, Qianlong dies. 15 days later, everything is over. This is not a story of gradual decline. It is a string pulled tighter and tighter for 20 years, and then suddenly snapping. By this point, the phrase China's greatest corrupt official no longer functions only as a sensational label. Behind it lies a much more important question. How does an intelligent, capable man gradually change when he acquires enormous power without sufficient restraint? Later generations remember the two words corrupt official. The label is not wrong, but if that is all we remember, we miss the more valuable questions. What kind of environment allows someone so intelligent and so capable to devote more and more of his talent to protecting private power? What kind of relationship between emperor and minister allows efficiency to outweigh supervision? Why did repeated warnings fail to change the outcome earlier? Why can a minister become more dangerous precisely as he becomes more indispensable? Those questions turn Heshen from a sensational villain into a historical figure worth studying. His story does not tell us that intelligence is useless. Quite the opposite. Intelligence is extremely useful. The question is what it serves. As a young man, Heshen used intelligence to escape hardship and earn imperial attention. In middle age, he used the same intelligence to handle complicated financial and administrative problems. Later, he used it again to manage relationships, protect interests, enlarge wealth, and block opponents. The ability did not disappear. Its direction changed. That is the real tragedy of Heshen. He was not an incompetent man accidentally handed power he did not deserve. He was a capable man who, after receiving too much power with too little restraint, gradually converted public ability into private assets. That is more troubling than ordinary greed. Jiaqing's lightning confiscation, meanwhile, was not merely an angry act of revenge. He moved immediately after Qianlong's death. First, Heshen was dismissed, then arrested, then examined by officials. The charges were published. The property was confiscated. Finally, when some ministers argued for a more brutal public punishment, Jiaqing reduced the sentence to ordered suicide. Every step was fast, but every step also carried a political message. The speed told the bureaucracy, the new emperor can decide. The formal charges told them, this is not merely personal revenge. The decision not to expand the purge indefinitely told them, return your loyalty to the throne, and everyone does not need to panic. The choice of ordered suicide rather than public extreme punishment told the empire, Jiaqing would still preserve a degree of dignity for a former chief minister who had once served his father. Viewed as a transition of power, the operation was remarkably controlled. Heshen had spent his career learning how to read emperors. In the end, he met an emperor who had already read him. Jiaqing did not need to fight Heshen for 20 years. He only needed to wait until Qianlong could no longer protect him. That may be the coldest fact in the entire story. Heshen spent more than 2 decades building his political empire. Jiaqing dismantled it in half a month. So the next time we hear the saying, when Heshen fell, Jiaqing ate his fill, we can add another layer. What fell was not only a rich man. It was a structure of power dependent on the old emperor. What Jiaqing took back was not only silver. It was control over the Grand Council, finance, appointments, and the movement of information. Gold and silver were merely the part ordinary people could see. Power was the invisible confiscation list. Prince Kung's mansion still stands in Beijing today. Visitors walk through its courtyards, corridors, halls, and gardens. Many arrive looking for the legends of Heshen's treasure, wanting to see where the supposed owner of 800 million taels once lived. But if we really want to understand Heshen, it may be better to spend less time searching for hidden gold. Stand in the courtyard and imagine two images. The first is around the 54th year of Qianlong's reign. The 10th princess has just married. The emperor personally visits the residence. Heshen stands inside a carefully constructed mansion. His son is an imperial son-in-law. He is one of the most powerful ministers at court. Outside his gate, countless people want his friendship. At that moment, he may believe there is nowhere higher for life to go. Now imagine the second image. Less than 10 years later, the same residence is being confiscated, storerooms sealed, contracts inventoried, treasures registered. The owner is not home. He is in a prison of the Board of Punishments. Only about 9 years separate the two scenes. The building did not suddenly change. The man did. That is one of the cruelest and most truthful things about history. The most stable object in an age is often not power. It is the building that remains standing after power has gone. Heshen thought he was constructing a mansion that proved his success. Later, the same mansion became evidence that he had crossed the line. He thought gold and silver meant security. Later, the gold and silver became charges. He thought marriage into the imperial family meant protection. Later, that relationship could save only part of his family. He believed no one understood the emperor better than he did. He forgot that emperors change. His rise came step by step. Education, imperial guard service, major investigations, financial administration, the Grand Council. His corruption also did not begin on one dramatic night when he suddenly opened a state treasury and started stealing. It developed as expanding public authority and private interest gradually blended together. His death was not divine punishment falling from the sky either. It was the rapid dismantling under a new emperor of a political structure that had depended too heavily on the old one. Remove the mythology, and the chain of cause and effect becomes clearer. That is why the greatest legacy of Heshen's life is not a wealth ranking that can be calculated to the last tael. It is an extraordinarily complete chain of causation. Talent made him visible. Efficiency made him useful. Usefulness brought him closer to money and appointments. Proximity to power caused others to attach themselves to him. Those relationships increased his wealth. Wealth and relationships made him need political protection even more. To protect power, he increasingly resisted supervision. The weaker supervision became, the safer and bolder he felt, until finally, every layer of security rested on a single support. Qianlong. When Qianlong died, the entire chain broke at once. That is Heshen. He was not a joke who climbed to the top through luck alone, nor was he an able minister who should be rehabilitated simply because he possessed talent. He was a genuinely complicated man, intelligent, diligent, financially capable, gifted with language and writing, extremely skilled at reading people. He could solve problems for the emperor, and then he learned how to use the emperor's trust to solve problems for himself. He rose from a young imperial guard to become one of the most powerful ministers in the empire and converted part of that power into astonishing private wealth. He believed he had built an unbreakable world. In the end, he discovered that the entire world had only one foundation. And in 1799, when that foundation disappeared, Heshen needed only 15 days to go from the foremost minister of the great Qing to a prisoner waiting for a strip of white silk. As for the legendary 800 million tales, we may never possess an account book reliable enough to calculate the exact total. But by now, we no longer need it, because the most important numbers Heshen left behind are not 800 million. They are more than 20 years. More than 20 years in which an intelligent man acquired more and more power one step at a time. And 15 days. 15 days in which a power minister who lost his protector was forced to surrender everything. If I had to choose which of those two numbers explains Heshen better, I would choose the second. Wealth tells us how much he may have taken. Speed tells us what his power was really built on. While Qianlong lived, almost no one could move against him. Once Qianlong was gone, 15 days were enough. That was the most astonishing account of Heshen's life. And that is where the story of Heshen ends. I'm Jason, the Eastern historian. See you in the next episode.